Jon Snow stood upon the windswept battlements of the wall, scanning the endless icy expanse to the north. He had once found strange comfort in this view, a sense that the enormity of the landscape matched the longing in his own soul. But tonight his eyes were restless, caught between 100 doubts. The wind howled around him, shrill and unrelenting, as if trying to tear away any illusions he might hold. For too many nights he had been haunted by the notion of honor and the demands of duty. Duty to the Night's Watch, yes, but also another duty he had for too long denied, the duty to himself, to his blood, to the name he might claim if only he dared. He heard the crunch of boots on the walkway behind him. A single flickering torch threw dancing shadows against the ice. He turned to see Samwell Tarly, cloak flapping in the gale, round face pinched with an anxiety that had become all too familiar. Sam had news, he always did, and Jon felt his heart thump heavier with foreboding. Sam nearly slipped as he approached, forcing Jon to step forward and catch him by the elbow. "Are you well?" Jon asked, his voice carrying in the dark. He made an effort to steady Sam, but found himself bracing against the gusts, too. "Bitter out," Sam replied, pulling his cloak tighter. "Maester Aemon wants you, Jon. There's a raven. From the south." Jon's stomach tightened. A raven from the south could mean many things, tidings of King Joffrey, the movements of Lannister forces, or maybe something about Robb Stark, the king in the north, Jon's half-brother in all but name. Jon seldom heard good news from beyond the wall these days. He exhaled, nodded once, and released Sam's arm. "Go inside," Jon said. "I'll come at once." Sam did not linger. Jon watched him hurry away, nearly stumbling down the steps into the dim corridors of Castle Black. The wind whistled in the new emptiness, and Jon closed his eyes, letting the cold lash his face as if to remind himself of his vow. To be the shield that guarded the realms of men. His life was oathbound, devoted to the Watch. And yet, the news of Robb's campaigns, the war tearing through the south, the rumors of the Stark host advancing or retreating like a restless tide, it all tugged at him, even though he tried to bury it. Robb was his brother in spirit, if not in father's name, and the last he had heard, Robb was facing storms on every front. The Lannisters threatened from the west, the Greyjoys from the sea, and now Stannis Baratheon from Dragonstone, or so the ravens said. He forced himself to descend, step by measured step, into the torchlit corridors that snaked through the fortress. Darkness pressed in on every side. The northern chill seeped through the stone. Soon he found himself in Maester Aemon's chamber, a cramped room crammed with shelves of old scrolls and battered tomes and warmed only by a small brazier in the corner. The smell of parchment and smoke filled Jon's senses. At the table sat Maester Aemon, blind eyes milky in the torchlight. Opposite him stood a man Jon did not recognize immediately, a knight by the look of the mail under his thick fur cloak, older than Jon by more than a decade, with a face carved by war and regret. Aemon turned his head toward Jon. "This is Ser Justin Massey," he said quietly. "He bears words from King Stannis Baratheon." Jon's chest tightened at the name. Stannis was the man who, in another turning of fate, had come to the wall to defend it against wildling invaders. In truth, it was Stannis who had saved the Night's Watch from certain defeat only weeks before, routing Mance Rayder's host. The self-proclaimed king had lingered in the north, seeking men's fealty. Jon had resisted. The Watch could not bend the knee to any king. But apparently Stannis had not abandoned the idea that the north might be his. Ser Justin stepped forward, offering a polite bow, though his expression was thin-lipped and grave. "Lord Snow, if that's how I may address you." "Simply Jon," Jon replied. He glanced at Aemon, who sat motionless, hands folded atop the table. "King Stannis wishes you to come to him," Ser Justin said. "We are encamped at Eastwatch for the time being. There are matters to discuss." Jon's pulse kicked. If it's a matter of needing more supplies, the Night's Watch is starved of resources ourselves. He tried to keep his tone neutral, but suspicion colored his words. A flicker crossed Ser Justin's features, half annoyance, half pity. "It's not about supplies, Jon Snow. The king extends you an offer. He wants a loyal warden in the north. One who stands apart from the Lannisters and from the false kings who would claim your father's seat. The north is too vast, too cold to be conquered by steel alone. It needs a Stark. Or close enough." Jon inhaled sharply. His first instinct was to refuse. He was a man of the Night's Watch. He had taken his vows. But the very suggestion that Stannis Baratheon wanted to name him Lord of Winterfell or something akin to it sent an unexpected tremor through Jon's body. A dream half-remembered. A dream that had died the moment he recited his oath before a weirwood tree. If the king in the north was Robb, how could Stannis hope to impose his will on those loyal to House Stark? Yet the war had changed everything. Betrayals, alliances, desperate pleas for strength, nothing was as it had been. and the vow from which Jon had drawn so much purpose was beginning to feel like a chain. "I have my duties here," Jon said, the words sounding hollow even to himself. "The Night's Watch must remain neutral in any war." "The king is aware," Ser Justin replied, "but it is time to face hard truths. The wildlings threaten, the White Walkers, if rumor can be believed, stir beyond the wall, and winter is coming. The realm needs unity. The king has a new plan. He would have you come south with him, bring the knowledge you have of the North, and secure Winterfell in his name. The lords of the North remember the name Stark. They will not bow easily to anyone else. But you, as lord or warden, they might. They might do so if you stand beside Stannis as his chosen." Jon's eyes flickered to Maester Aemon, whose face was stoic. Jon could glean no clue in his expression. "And my brother?" Jon asked, voice tight. "Robb Stark continues his war, of course," Ser Justin replied. "But King Stannis believes the boy has shown weaknesses. Too young, too trusting, or so the rumors go. He has lost the Frey's favor at the Twins. The Greyjoys raid at will. There is talk of dissatisfaction among his own bannermen. He is not unstoppable. If Stannis can secure the loyalty of northern houses through you, the tide may shift." Jon wanted to protest that he would never betray Robb, but the word betray caught in his mind like a blade. For so many nights he had tried not to think of how easily the Watch had turned its back on the very houses that gave it men. He reminded himself that the Watch must remain separate, but was that truly the best course when the entire realm might collapse under the chaos of war? Robb was a wolf at war. Stannis was a proven commander with the might to hold the North against southern armies. Perhaps, whispered a voice in the darkest corners of Jon's mind, this was a chance to protect the North, to truly protect it, not just to stand on a decaying wall while winter descended. And if the price was kneeling to Stannis, what did that matter if Jon could preserve his father's land, his family's home? Jon realized he had gone silent too long. Ser Justin watched him carefully. There was a faint glimmer in the knight's eye, as if he recognized the turmoil brewing behind Jon's stare. "I'll think on it," Jon said, swallowing. "Do so quickly," Ser Justin replied. "The king will not wait forever. Our ravens say Robb Stark marches west. We do not know what will come next. Stannis needs you at Eastwatch soon." Jon nodded curtly. He gave a final glance to Maester Aemon, who remained still, then turned and strode from the chamber, cloak swirling behind him. His mind was a storm, thoughts colliding like crashing waves. Once in the corridor, he pressed his back against the cold stone and closed his eyes. Every oath he had made, every vow he had uttered seemed to weigh him down. He had chosen to be a man of the Night's Watch. But part of him whispered that perhaps, if the realm needed it, if his own blood needed it, he should do what must be done, regardless of that vow. In the following days, Jon tried to keep to his duties. He supervised the new recruits, patrolled the walls, and spoke with the brothers who had become his companions. Still, his mind drifted. He thought of the stories old Nan used to tell, stories of Stark lords in Winterfell's great hall, presiding with a stoic dignity that demanded loyalty. He thought of his father's ghost, a looming presence that demanded honor above all. But there was also another ghost, that of Robb, a boy who'd made himself a king, who had led the Northmen into a war that might tear them apart. Had Robb made the wrong choices? Could the North survive if Robb's alliances continued to crumble? He avoided telling anyone about Ser Justin's proposition. Even Sam, who noticed Jon's sullen quiet, got only vague answers in return for concerned questions. Jon found himself pacing, unable to sleep for more than a few hours a night. He felt the lure of that hidden dream, that perhaps he was worthy to stand as a Stark, to rule in Winterfell, and to keep the North safe in ways Robb could not. But it made him feel hollow too, as if giving in would betray the only brother who had ever truly accepted him as part of the family. But what if Robb had changed? War changed men. Betrayals changed them more. The thought pressed relentlessly, and by the second week, Jon's resolve was unraveling. He went to Maester Aemon, hoping for counsel. "Maester," Jon said quietly, standing in that cramped chamber again, the brazier's light flickering on the walls. "I'm torn. You know what Ser Justin offered." "I do," Aemon said softly, not turning his head. "You would be wise to think carefully. The Watch has known kings before. Aegon Targaryen himself once bestowed honors on many a brother." Jon exhaled, a soft, cold breath in the gloom. "My father always told me a man must keep his word, or he is no man at all. I swore a vow. But if my vows lead me to watch the North collapse under the madness of war, what good is that vow? If I can do something to save it, shouldn't I?" Maester Aemon's wrinkled hands tightened around one another. "Honor is a precious thing, Jon. But sometimes we who wear the black must look beyond personal oaths to the greater purpose. If you believe your path lies with Stannis, that you can do more good there than here, then perhaps that is the way. Jon wanted him to give a clear answer, to say yes, to say no, but Aemon gave none. He gave only empathy, only the weight of years behind his blind eyes. Jon left, feeling as though every corridor was a labyrinth of doubt. Still, the days passed, and each passing day brought more news. Raven after raven announced greater turmoil in the south. It seemed that Robb was riding west to deal with the threat of the Lannisters again, but rumors were swirling that the Freys were balking, that House Karstark had muttered about old grievances. And always, there was the rumor that Stannis marched under the Flaming Heart, that the Red Priestess was at his side, and that men were bending the knee out of desperation or fear. At last, one evening after a sleepless night spent atop the wall, Jon saddled a horse. He told no one but Maester Aemon that he was traveling to Eastwatch. He left his black cloak behind, a sign that he was going under uncertain pretenses. Yet he told the gate guards only that he was going on a diplomatic errand, as was sometimes necessary with Stannis's men. He rode east, the bitter wind cutting across the frozen ground. The snows had not yet fully descended, though the first flurries dusted the fields. The cold bit at his cheeks, and Ghost, his dire wolf, padded alongside him silently, red eyes scanning the horizon as if he sensed the turmoil in Jon's heart. On the third day's ride, he saw the smoke from the campfires before he saw the tents. Stannis had pitched a modest camp in the lee of Eastwatch's walls, a cluster of stiff canvas pavilions and wooden palisades. Guards in the Baratheon sigil, Crown Stag, though recently merged with the Fiery Heart, stood watch. They let Jon pass with only a little hesitation, for the rumors of Jon Snow's presence at the wall had spread even among Stannis's knights. Ghost drew more eyes, the white dire wolf a silent sentinel at Jon's heel. Jon was led to a large pavilion near the center, the wind snapping at the Baratheon banner overhead. Inside, the warmth from multiple braziers struck him first, followed by the smell of burnt pepper and spiced wine. A table stood near the entrance, cluttered with maps. Bent over those maps stood a woman in red, her hair the color of flame, her robes clinging to her form. Melisandre. She regarded Jon with a curious gaze, as though peering into the heart of him. "My king," she said softly, eyes never leaving Jon. Then she stepped aside. There, at the far end of the table, stood Stannis Baratheon. His hair was thinning, his face gaunt, yet his presence filled the pavilion. He wore a simple wool tunic, but pinned at his breast was the Fiery Heart, the symbol of the Lord of Light. When he lifted his head to see Jon, his expression was stern, appraising. "You've come," Stannis said. His voice was as cold as the wind outside, but in his eyes was the faintest flicker of triumph. He gestured toward the chair across from him, near the maps. "Sit." Jon hesitated, then obliged. His legs felt heavier than they should, as if the burdens of a lifetime weighed upon him. Ghost settled near his feet, glaring at Melisandre with silent intensity. Stannis noticed but made no comment. "We've been here for weeks," Stannis said. "Your Lord Commander Ser Alliser, is it, has been none too eager to parley. I had half a mind to march on Castle Black myself." Jon avoided meeting Stannis's gaze directly. "We have little to offer, your grace. The Night's Watch is sworn to neutrality." Stannis's lip curled. "You speak of your vows as though they are the word of gods. Yet the real gods, or the one true God, demands that we save the realm from the terrors rising in the north. I have done my duty and come to defend the wall. And I will do my duty to claim the Iron Throne by right of law. But you have choices, bastard though you may be. And I offer you a name, a castle, and the loyalty of the king. Become Jon Stark, Warden of the North, and call the banners to me." Jon heard his own breath in the hush of the pavilion. Melisandre studied him intently. He felt a burn under his skin, as though her red eyes could see every secret in his heart. He swallowed. "My brother. Robb Stark is called king in the north." "Your brother is no true king," Stannis replied curtly. "He made himself so by acclamation of northern lords. I hold the rightful claim under the laws of succession. If you stand with me, the Northmen will bend. They remember the name Stark, but they also remember Robert Baratheon as their friend and ally. Many lords despise the Lannisters more than they love the boy they followed out of grief for your father." Jon wanted to argue, to defend Robb, but so many doubts churned in him. He remembered the reports of Robb's setbacks, the tension with the Freys, the whispers that he had wed some highborn girl from the west, spurning the alliance he had once promised. Jon realized that part of him was angry at Robb too, for taking on a mantle too heavy, for waging a war that risked so many northern lives. And beneath that anger was a longing so fierce it hurt, the longing to be recognized, to be more than the bastard son of Ned Stark, to have a place, a name that was truly his. Stannis seemed to sense the flicker of hunger behind Jon's eyes. The The choice is simple, Stannis continued. Remain on the wall and watch the Seven Kingdoms burn, watch the White Walkers sweep south, watch House Stark fade into history. Or stand with me, claim your rightful seat as a son of Eddard Stark, gather the Northmen behind our banner, and restore order. Jon clenched his jaw. He could not find the words. In truth, he had never fully considered what it would mean to truly betray Robb if it was betrayal. If Robb had already lost the war, was Jon's acceptance of Stannis' offer truly a betrayal, or was it an act to salvage what remained of House Stark? Melisandre's voice slipped through the tension. The flames show great portents, Jon Snow. You are meant to stand against the cold and darkness. This is the path to fulfill the prophecy. You must do what is necessary. The wolves in the south fight each other, blind to the gathering night. Jon glanced at her, uneasy. He felt the dire wolf inside him bristle at the mention of prophecy. I'll not believe in shadows and flames without proof. Stannis slammed a gauntlet hand on the table where a map of Westeros lay pinned by small stones. Consider this your proof. I have the power to name you Lord of Winterfell. I have the will to see you installed. Accept, and I shall march south by your side, bringing justice to the traitors. Deny me and remain a bastard in black while the north bleeds. Jon closed his eyes. He thought of Robb, of how they'd parted ways in Winterfell, of how his father had marched south and never returned. He thought of the half-known truths of war. Could he truly turn his back on Robb's cause? But was Robb even winning? If the war was lost, if the North would soon be ravaged by Lannisters or Greyjoys or even the Boltons, perhaps saving it required forging a new path. Slowly, with a voice that felt distant from his body, Jon said, "What would you require of me? Should I bend the knee?" Stannis' tone hardened, but behind it was triumph. "You will renounce any claim that Robb Stark is the rightful king in the North. You will swear fealty to me, Stannis of House Baratheon. In return, I will legitimize you as Jon Stark, Warden of the North. Once Winterfell is reclaimed from the traitors and the Ironborn, you will rule it in my name. And when we march south, you will call the bannermen to our cause." Jon's heart hammered like a smith's hammer. The cost was high. He swallowed again, feeling Ghost press closer, sensing his master's turmoil. "And the Night's Watch?" he managed. Stannis waved a dismissive hand. "Maester Aemon can remain to oversee them. We'll find a new Lord Commander, if your brothers accept it. I doubt many would stand against you leaving. They owe me for defending their precious wall. The realm is bigger than that old pile of ice. The real war is for the survival of Westeros, and we must unite under one king." Jon stared down at the map. The outline of the North loomed before him, a vast domain. Winterfell's name seemed to sear into his vision. He could almost smell the crypts of his ancestors, hear the howling wind in the Godswood. To be Lord of Winterfell, the dream he had never dared speak aloud. But at what cost? He saw Robb's face in his mind's eye, bright with youthful determination, the bond they once shared. Would Robb brand him a traitor, a faithless half-brother who spurned the vow of brotherhood for a crown? Something inside Jon twisted painfully, but his mind went back to the stories of war, of how lords had begun to doubt Robb and how the North might be left in ruins. Perhaps, in a savage irony, the best way to preserve the North was to turn against its king. A bitterness filled his mouth. Yet he heard himself speak. "I will do it," Jon said. His voice trembled, but in the hush of the pavilion, no one missed it. "I will bend the knee, if it means saving my father's lands and the people of the North from more bloodshed and from the threats beyond the wall. Robb, he is my brother, but the realm needs unity. House Stark cannot stand alone." A faint smile ghosted across Stannis' lips. He reached for a parchment that Melisandre handed him. "Kneel." Jon's knees hit the ground. He tried not to think of the vow he had sworn to the Night's Watch, of the words he was now casting aside. He tried not to think of Robb's face, or of how Eddard Stark, wherever he rested, might judge him. Stannis laid a hand on Jon's head, solemnly pronouncing words that conferred legitimacy. "By the power of the Iron Throne, as the rightful king of Westeros, I name you Jon Stark, Warden of the North, Lord of Winterfell. Rise, my lord." Jon rose slowly, feeling as though a chain had been removed even as another was clamped around his soul. He was free of the watch in a sense, but now he belonged to Stannis. Melisandre's eyes gleamed in the brazier's light. Jon stared at his hand, half expecting to see some mark, some sign that he had just committed an irrevocable sin. But there was only flesh, trembling slightly. Ghost pressed closer still, as if to assure Jon he was not alone. That night, Stannis celebrated quietly with his knights and men. There was little in the way of feasting, supplies were meager, and Stannis did not indulge in lavish banquets at the best of times. But there was mulled wine, and a sense of relief among them that the North might yet be brought to heel through the new Lord Stark. Jon drank little, speaking mostly in monosyllables as men offered curt congratulations. Davos Seaworth, Stannis's hand, approached with a gentle nod, murmuring that he hoped this would save lives in the days to come. Jon said he hoped so too and meant it. His greatest prayer was that somehow, by forging this alliance, the North might be spared the worst of the war. Yet he knew in the shadows of his heart that Robb would never forgive him. He tried to sleep in a small corner of the pavilion, but the chill in his bones was not from the cold. He dreamt of dire wolves snarling at each other in the godwood, of swords clashing in the great hall of Winterfell, of red eyes in the darkness. He woke more than once, staring into the silence, wondering if he had done the right thing. By dawn, the plan was made. Stannis and a contingent of his knights would ride to several northern strongholds known to be wavering, or at least to have refused Robb's calls. Jon, wearing a new cloak of wolf-grey with the sigil of House Stark, would accompany them. The idea was to secure the oaths of these bannermen. With Jon Stark in their midst, men who might hesitate to kneel before a southern king would at least be more open to hearing Stannis's case. Jon parted from the brothers of the Watch at Eastwatch with little fanfare. He had only given them the barest explanation that he was following the king to negotiate on behalf of the North. Maester Aemon said farewell with a thin, sad smile, as if he knew precisely the path Jon had taken but judged him not. Jon said his goodbyes to Sam, who looked stricken and uncertain but who embraced him and whispered that he hoped Jon knew what he was doing. The words weighed on Jon's soul, but he rode out, Ghost loping alongside, and did not look back. They headed first for House Serwyn, whose castle lay not far south of the eastern roads. The travel was difficult. The roads were rutted with frozen mud, and a biting wind swept through the pines. Men muttered about the onset of a harsh winter earlier than usual. Even the knights, hardy as they were, kept their cloaks wrapped tightly and their horses pressed together for warmth. Jon was grateful for Ghost's silent presence. At night, the dire wolf lay near him, and Jon's dreams were calmer, though still tinged with anxiety. Upon reaching the gates of Castle Serwyn, they found them closed. But once a messenger was sent to announce Lord Jon Stark, the gates creaked open. The Serwyn lords had lost men fighting for Robb, but they now faced new threats. The Bolton influence nearby, Ironborn raiders striking at the coast. They listened to Stannis with weary eyes and responded with a grudging acceptance. The presence of Ned Stark's bastard, now by royal decree a legitimate Stark, made them hesitate. But they recognized the ring of truth in Stannis's claims. Robb was far away, locked in battles from which he might never return. They needed someone to hold the North together. And so Serwyn bent the knee to Stannis, albeit quietly, and swore to send what men they could spare. That was the first success. More followed in a trickle. Smaller houses, lesser lords who had grown disillusioned by the war, chose to ally with Stannis when Jon came to speak with them. He did his best to channel his father's sense of honor, to show them sincerity and loyalty, even if the cost was his soul. As they rode from keep to keep, the Red Witch, Melisandre, sometimes rode beside him, speaking in cryptic phrases about destiny and the fight against darkness. Jon tried to ignore her as best he could, but every so often, he caught her fierce stare. He wondered if she could see the shame that roiled in him at the thought of turning from Robb. In time, letters were sent to the Boltons, the Umbers, the Manderleys. Some responded with caution, others with outright silence. Rumors came that the Boltons were still claiming fealty to Robb, though the Dreadfort's loyalty was questionable at best. The Umbers, half of whom were rumored to support Robb wholeheartedly, had refused to break with the king in the north. The Manderleys, entrenched in White Harbor, were famously loyal to House Stark, but now torn by the question of Robb's leadership. The war had cost them ships and men. Would they see Jon as a usurper or as the rightful son of Ned Stark stepping in to restore the North? Stannis pressed the advantage of time. He wanted to make for Winterfell itself to claim the seat before the snow fell heavier. But news came of the Ironborn harrying the northern coasts, so Stannis diverted, hoping to crush the raiders or at least block them from taking Deepwood Motte. Jon accompanied him, uncertain if he was more terrified or relieved that they would not yet clash with Robb's forces. Winter closed in as they reached Deepwood Motte, a stout wooden fortress overshadowed by thick forests. The Ironborn presence was strong, but after a short siege, Stannis' disciplined knights overran them. Many of the Ironborn retreated to their ships, some were slain or captured. The victory was welcome, though it cost them time and men, and the cold deepened. Jon fought in the thick of the battle, sword in hand, ghost at his side, and discovered that serving Stannis' cause felt both exhilarating and guilt-ridden. He was fighting for the North's safety, was he not? Yet each stroke of his blade reminded him he had turned from the Watch and from Robb. After the siege, they tended to the wounded in Deepwood Motte's hall. Jon helped hold down a screaming man whose arm had to be cauterized. He shared a stale crust of bread with a battered squire who had lost an ear. War was a brutal business, and Jon wondered if Robb, wherever he was, saw the same horrors, felt the same weariness of soul. That night, as the victors warmed themselves by fires in the courtyard, Stannis summoned Jon to a private discussion. They gathered in a small solar within Deepwood's main keep, the wind rattling the shutters. Melisandre was there, too, silent and watchful. Davos stood to one side, his kind face deep in thought. "We must move on Winterfell before the snows grow deeper," Stannis said, voice clipped. "Word spreads that the Boltons may already have designs on the castle. I won't allow them to seize it. That whelp Ramsay is rumored to be forging alliances in the chaos. We march in 2 days' time." Jon swallowed hard, feeling a pang in his heart at the name Bolton. Rumors of their cruelty abounded. "And what of Robb?" Jon asked quietly. "He might be heading there as well." "Robb Stark is far to the west," Davos interjected gently. "Our scouts report that he and his main host are engaged near the crag. It's unlikely he can return to Winterfell in time, even if he wanted to. We expect no large resistance from his supporters here." Jon felt an uneasy relief. If Robb was occupied, then maybe they could avoid meeting in open battle. The thought of crossing swords with his brother's men was too bitter to bear. "So be it," Jon said softly. "But the North will not forgive us if Winterfell is taken by force. Many houses still hold it sacred. They might blame Stannis for usurping Robb's seat." Stannis' mouth tightened. "That is precisely why you must hold it in my name, Jon Stark. It's your seat by birth, by new birth, if you will. Once the Boltons are cast out, I'll place you in charge. Then let any man call it usurpation." Jon nodded, face taut. Melisandre broke her silence. "Winterfell stands upon powerful currents of magic where the old gods still linger. There is significance in the Stark lineage. This is more than mere politics, Jon Snow. You were meant to be there." Jon could not bring himself to speak. He only nodded, cold dread in his stomach. That night, he slept fitfully, dreaming of the crypts beneath Winterfell, of ancient kings staring at him with hollow eyes, accusing him of betrayal. Marching on Winterfell took them another fortnight. The winds blew harder. Snow fell in flurries, dusting the trees and making every league a trial. Stannis' men pressed on, cursing the cold and longing for the comforts of the south. Jon rode at the head with Stannis, though he wondered if he deserved the place. He was a green lord, newly named, with no real experience in leading an army. Yet Stannis demanded his visible presence. Whenever they passed a northern village, Stannis would order a short stop so Jon could speak with the folk, reassure them that House Stark was not dead, that the king had come to restore order. Jon's words were measured, his voice often uncertain, but the people saw the Stark in his face, Ned's visage, so many told him, and in their desperation they believed. Or if they did not believe, they at least offered no resistance. Finally, on a gray morning when the wind smelled of distant storms, they glimpsed Winterfell's towers. Jon's throat tightened at the sight, an ache of memory and longing. Once he had lived here as a child, overshadowed by Robb. Now he approached with an army intending to claim it. The gates were shut, but through the swirl of snow, Jon saw men on the battlements, the flayed man of House Bolton. A rage twisted in his stomach. They had no right to that castle. Even if Robb were absent, no Bolton should ever claim Winterfell. Stannis' army encamped outside the walls. Drums beat. The men prepared for a siege. But the Boltons, apparently led by that twisted whelp Ramsay Snow, now calling himself Bolton, did not surrender. Scouts reported the presence of scattered bands of Ironborn as well, leftover reavers who had seized part of the keep in the chaos after Theon Greyjoy's assault. A bitter irony, bastards battling over House Stark's seat. Jon told himself he was nothing like Ramsay, that his cause was righteous. But the cold in his gut suggested otherwise. At dawn, Stannis ordered his rams forward. The gates of Winterfell were strong but not impossible to breach. A hail of arrows met the first wave of attackers. Jon joined the fight, though Davos tried to caution him to remain behind the lines. But Jon refused. If he was to claim Winterfell, he would fight for it. He saw men die, struck by arrows or spears. He clashed steel with a Bolton man-at-arms, their swords ringing out against the snow. Ghost tore into the enemy lines, savage and silent, scattering the archers. At last, a section of the gate gave way under the battering rams. Stannis' knights poured in. Jon led a handful of northern volunteers, Serwyn men, Glover men who had returned to the fold, and they surged through the courtyard. The Boltons resisted fiercely. Ramsay's men had set traps, pitfall spikes beneath snowdrifts, hot oil ready to be flung from the battlements. The stench of burning flesh and the screams of the wounded filled the air. Jon felt ice settle in his chest. Or in Winterfell, the place of his childhood joys now defiled by terror and cruelty. He spotted Ramsay across the yard, a sneer curling the bastard's lips as he unleashed hounds upon the intruders. Jon had no time to worry about them. Ghost snarled and lunged at one monstrous hound, jaws clamping around its throat. Jon cut down another soldier who rushed him, then felt an arrow graze his shoulder. Pain lanced through him, hot and sharp. He nearly stumbled but forced himself forward. Winterfell's walls had to be reclaimed. Amid the chaos, the Ironborn fought as well, though they seemed more interested in killing anyone in their path. The clash of armies quickly devolved into savage close-quarters fighting. Jon's arm began to ache from the repeated shock of steel against steel. He spied Melisandre standing near the gate, chanting in a language he did not recognize, the wind whipping her red robes. Whether her sorcery had any effect, Jon could not say, but the courtyard seemed alight with a strange glow. He pressed on, forging deeper into the keep. Blood stained the snow in slick patches, making footing treacherous. The clangor of battle echoed off the stone walls. Soldiers rushed from side passages only to be met by Stannis' knights. Ramsay Bolton was nowhere to be found now, presumably retreating deeper into the labyrinth of corridors. Winterfell is ours, bellowed a knight behind Jon, raising a tattered Baratheon banner. But the fighting was not yet done. Jon made for the great hall, memories flooding him. He recalled the feasts, the laughter of his siblings, the watchful eye of his father at the high table. Now, the doors were splintered, the corridor dark except for flickering torchlight. He kicked aside a body that lay in the threshold and entered. Inside, a handful of Bolton men waited, forming a last stand. They recognized him, calling him traitor and false Stark. Jon gritted his teeth. Did they know or care what the name meant to him? They attacked. Jon met them with fury, adrenaline surging. He dispatched one man with a swift cut across the chest. Another swung a mace at him, but Jon stepped aside, then Ghost leapt at the attacker's throat. The man screamed, blood spraying, and dropped. The rest scrambled back, only to be cut down by Stannis' men entering from behind. The great hall was claimed. Shaking, Jon took in the devastation. Broken benches, shattered casks of ale, bodies sprawled on the floor. The keep was all but retaken now, though pockets of resistance likely remained. Stannis entered behind him, breath steaming in the chill air, eyes gleaming with the certainty of victory. Secure the castle, Stannis commanded his men. Ramsay must not escape. By sundown, the last of the Bolton and Ironborn forces had either fled or been killed. Ramsay's body was discovered near the kennels, torn apart by his own starving hounds, a grim testament to his cruelty. The flayed man banners were ripped down, replaced by the crowned stag of Baratheon. But even as a small cheer rose among Stannis' men, Jon felt no elation. He stared at the gray walls, the familiar corridors, the ghosts of memory that drifted around him. Winterfell was in his grasp, the home he had never truly possessed. That evening, Stannis convened his war council in the great hall, the damage hastily cleared. Torches flickered on soot-stained walls. Jon stood at the high table, feeling a knot in his throat. He had always stood below, a bastard among true-born children. Now, the seat at the head was his by decree of the king. With a solemn expression, Stannis declared Winterfell the seat of Lord Jon Stark, Warden of the North. Knights pounded the table in applause, though some among them looked uneasy, uncertain of how the northern lords would react. Jon accepted their bows and salutes with numb shock. Only then did the survivors of Winterfell's staff, old servants, stable hands, the blacksmith, Come forth." They looked at Jon with wide eyes, seeing Ned Stark's face in his. Some knelt awkwardly, unsure. He told them to stand, that he was no king. The older ones, who remembered Ned, wept openly, uncertain if it was from relief or sorrow. Jon felt tears sting his own eyes, but he did not let them fall. He had made this choice. Now he had to live with it. As the night wore on, men feasted on what provisions were left. The fires were stoked high. The halls echoed with talk of the battles yet to come. Stannis meant to press his claim across the rest of the north, rally more houses, and then march south once he was strong enough to challenge King Joffrey or whatever Lannister puppet still held the Iron Throne. But the largest question hung in the air like a shadow. How would Robb Stark respond? The king in the north would soon learn that his half-brother had sided with Stannis and claimed Winterfell. War between them might be inevitable. Days passed, turning into a fortnight. Jon set about trying to restore some semblance of order to Winterfell. The walls needed repairs, the kitchen's reorganization. He walked the courtyard in a haze of memories. Every stone, every archway reminded him of times gone by. He found the old archery yard where he and Robb had practiced as boys. The target posts were rotted, arrows scattered. He remembered how Robb used to tease him about his aim. A wave of grief crashed over him. He had not truly felt it until now. He was alone here, no father, no brothers or sisters. He was Lord Stark by decree, but in his heart he felt a black emptiness. Was the North truly saved by this? Meanwhile, ravens flew south carrying Stannis' demands of fealty. Some lords of the North sent measured replies, others scornful rejections. The Manderleys were silent. The Umbers split. The Boltons might have been subdued, but the war was far from ended. And always, Jon thought of Robb. Letters were sent to him as well, inviting him to treat with Stannis at Winterfell, but no answer came. One dusk, as Jon brooded in the Godwood, a quiet figure joined him, Davos Seaworth. The old smuggler-turned-hand was a man of gentle courtesy. He bowed his head to the weirwood tree as though uncertain how to address the old gods. "I was told I'd find you here, my lord," Davos said. He offered a small, apologetic smile. "I hope I'm not intruding." Jon shook his head. "The Godwood is for all, even if these gods are not yours." Davos nodded. "I came to tell you news has arrived from the south. Your brother, King Robb, has had a victory near Riverrun. He's captured the King's Lair again. But we also have rumors that he suffered a defeat at the Twins, the Frey's turning coat. The specifics are unclear." Jon's heart twisted. One moment a victory, the next a defeat. Was Robb's war unraveling? He could not speak, so he only stared at the face on the ancient weirwood, the red sap weeping from the carved eyes. After a moment, Davos continued softly, "I know this cannot be easy for you, my lord. You have chosen a path that sets you against your own kin. I have sons, or I had sons, and I can only imagine the pain. But sometimes duty compels us to do what we must." Jon gave a bitter laugh. "That word, duty. I swore a vow once to the Night's Watch and I broke it. Now I've sworn fealty to Stannis. But the vow I feel most deeply is the vow to my blood. And that vow too I have shattered." Davos looked pained. "War is a cruel master. I do not know how the winds of fate will blow, but I've seen good men forced into heartbreaking choices. All we can do is try to spare as many innocent lives as possible. That is what I believe." Jon nodded, unsure how to voice the torrent of regret and confusion inside him. He wanted to ask Davos if he truly believed Stannis would make a just ruler, if this alliance was the right course for the North. But the words would not come. He thought of the house words that had shaped his life. Winter is coming. A warning, a promise, a fate. Jon stared into the weirwood's face, wishing the old gods would speak and tell him how to atone. Over the next weeks, winter's grip tightened. Snow piled high around Winterfell's walls. Some of Stannis' men grumbled about the freezing conditions, begging to retreat south. But Stannis would not move yet. He intended to wait for lords to come to him, or at least to make contact once the snows relented. Jon worked to keep the men fed, sending out small foraging parties. He tried to see to the repairs of the castle, but resources were scarce. The old library was half-burned, the stables in disarray. He felt like a ghost walking through the ruins of a lost life. Then one cold morning, a raven arrived. The news it carried was short and chilling. Robb Stark had learned of Jon's betrayal. A messenger from the south bore Robb's words. He would never yield Winterfell to a pretender, especially not to one who wore the false name of Stark. The letter condemned Stannis as an usurper and Jon as a traitor, stating that Robb would reclaim Winterfell as soon as he was able. Jon's hand shook as he read it. The words scalded him: half-brother, bastard, oathbreaker. Stannis read it too. The boy has bared his teeth, he remarked. Does he truly think to march here in the dead of winter? Foolish pride. He should have joined us. Now we'll have to defeat him. Jon stared at the parchment. The accusations leapt at him as if aflame. Oathbreaker. He tried to breathe, but each breath was ragged with guilt and sorrow. He was indeed an oathbreaker. And now his own brother named him traitor. The North was no closer to unity. The war threatened to come to Winterfell in a final, savage conflict between the two men who bore Ned Stark's blood. That night, alone in his father's old solar, Jon sat before a dying fire. He should have felt warm in these chambers, but the emptiness chilled him more than the northern winds. A single candle guttered on the desk, casting flickering shadows. He rested Robb's letter beside him. Betrayal, that was the word, repeated again and again in his mind. Had he done right or wrong? If he continued down this path, he might face Robb in open battle. He pictured the armies of the North arrayed on a snowy field, brother against brother. The weirwood in his dream had wept red tears. Was that the blood of House Stark? Ghost whined softly from the corner, sensing Jon's distress. Jon reached out to stroke the direwolf's fur. What have I done, boy? He whispered. Ghost blinked those red eyes at him, silent and unreadable. Jon remembered a day long ago when his father returned from his execution of a deserter. Ned had told him that the man who passes the sentence must swing the sword. A man must own his actions. Jon had accepted Stannis' decree, he had bent the knee, and now he must own the blood that would come of it. He thought of returning to the Wall, of renouncing all claims and disappearing into the frozen North. But that would abandon the North to chaos, break another oath, and accomplish nothing. Stannis would still press the claim, and Robb would still fight him. Winterfell would remain a battleground. At least if Jon was here, maybe he could minimize the devastation. Or so he told himself. The memories weighed on him, the specter of Ned Stark's disappointed gaze haunting him. He closed his eyes and shuddered, uncertain of how to proceed. Days crept by, each colder than the last. Reports came that Robb was stalled in the Riverlands, trapped by the shifting allegiances of the Freys and Lannisters. Some whispered that a new alliance might form around the Tyrells or the Martells, but it was all rumor. The snows around Winterfell grew so deep that many roads were blocked. Supply trains had difficulty reaching the castle. Stannis' men began to starve, rationing what little grain they had. Tensions flared. Fights broke out in the courtyard over scraps of food. Jon tried to maintain order, doubling the guards on the granary, but the desperation was palpable. Meanwhile, northern folk from surrounding villages came seeking shelter, fleeing raids or the cold. Jon let them in, for how could he refuse them? The great hall filled with frightened families, cowering in corners, children coughing in the bitter air. One evening, a ragged group of riders arrived. They were men loyal to House Glover, led by Galbart Glover himself, who had parted ways with Robb after some perceived slight. The group had braved the storms to bend the knee to Stannis and Jon. They were half-frozen, half-starved, and outraged at the neglect they claimed to have suffered under Robb's cause. Jon listened with a heavy heart. Every moment hammered home the fracturing of the North. Robb had lost some of his closest allies. Jon accepted the Glover men's fealty, though it tasted of ash. Another wedge driven between him and Robb. As winter's darkness grew, Melisandre's presence became more ominous. She roamed the castle with silent tread, sometimes appearing in the strangest places. A tower stairwell, the courtyard at midnight, her red robes billowing in unseen winds. She claimed the cold was a sign that the Great Other, the enemy of the Lord of Light, stirred in the far north. Jon tried to avoid her, unnerved by her talk of shadows and flames. But occasionally she would speak to him, telling him the war was necessary for the coming battle against eternal night. She implied that he had a destiny that would see him face horrors beyond imagination. Jon said nothing, but her words burrowed into his dreams. Then one day a raven arrived from the Umbers. They were known for their size and fierce loyalty to the Starks, but had been divided between supporting Robb and simply trying to defend their own lands. The raven carried a message for Jon Stark from the great Jon Umber himself. Rumors said that Robb had been betrayed at the Twins, that his cause was in jeopardy. The great Jon, apparently still captive somewhere, could do little to help. The letter ended with a plea for House Stark to keep the North from falling to ruin, urging Jon to gather what strength he could. It was a letter that smelled of despair. If Robb's war was truly collapsing, then the North was more vulnerable than ever. Jon laid the letter aside. He felt as though he were in a waking nightmare, drifting from one piece of bitter news to another. He knew in the abstract that men must do what they can to survive. That Stannis' cause might indeed offer the best hope for the North. Yet the knowledge that he had effectively turned on Robb weighed on him like a manacle around his neck. One twilight in the ramparts of Winterfell, Jon found himself gazing out over the snowy fields, a swirl of white in the dying light. He remembered standing here with Robb once, both of them excited at the prospect of their first real hunts. Now, the courtyard below was filled with tents housing Stannis' men, their banners snapping in the wind. The old gatehouse showed scars from the siege. A part of Jon wanted to go to Robb, to talk to him, to explain why he had done this. But winter's snows lay thick, and even if he could reach Robb, the boy king might not listen. Perhaps he would only greet Jon with steel. A soft step behind him made Jon whirl. It was Celis Baratheon, Stannis' wife, her face stern and humorless. She gave him a curt nod. "You're needed in the hall. My lord husband has summoned his council." More news from the south. Jon quietly followed her, stomach twisting. In the great hall, he found Stannis, Melisandre, Davos, and a handful of northern lords. A hush hung over them. On the table lay a piece of parchment, bearing news from King's Landing, apparently. Something about Joffrey's marriage to Margaery Tyrell, or rumors of a second invasion attempt by the Ironborn. Jon felt only numbness. The realm was tearing itself apart. Stannis was determined to be the victor. Robb was somewhere out there, outnumbered and perhaps betrayed. The snows might trap them all. Outside, winter pressed in, a silent and unyielding judge. When the council was done discussing strategy, men trickled out to tend to daily tasks. Jon lingered, uncertain if he should remain, but Stannis held him back with a glance. When they were alone in the hall, save for Melisandre's silent presence, Stannis spoke in his blunt way. "You look troubled." Jon let out a long breath. He was tired of pretense. "Yes, your grace. Every day I wonder if I made the right choice. I wonder if I've damned myself by betraying my brother." Stannis' mouth curled. "Your brother betrayed the realm by styling himself king. He fractured the unity of the Seven Kingdoms. The boy led good men to ruin and stands no chance of defeating the Lannisters alone. If the rumors are to be believed, he's undone by his own poor alliances." Jon said nothing. He knew Stannis was not entirely wrong, but that did not ease the pain. What if he marches here? If he tries to retake Winterfell? Stannis' gaze hardened. "Then I will meet him in battle, and you will stand with me, Jon Stark. You have sworn your fealty." Jon felt his gut twist. "Yes," he whispered. Stannis nodded sharply, satisfied. "Good. War spares no one, and we cannot afford to be squeamish now. The real threat is beyond the wall, so we must first unify the kingdom. If that means defeating your brother, so be it." With that, Stannis turned and stalked away. Melisandre cast Jon a lingering look, then followed. Jon stood there, the shadows of the hall playing across the stone floor. Ghost slipped in, silent as ever, and brushed against Jon's leg. Jon sank to one knee and ruffled the direwolf's fur. Though his thoughts were far away, he could almost see Robb's face, accusing him. For a moment, he let himself think of the joys they'd shared, chasing each other through the yards, laughing at Bran's attempts to climb the walls, teasing Arya about her needlework. Now all of it was drowned in the blood of war and betrayal. Jon wondered if he had lost himself when he left the Night's Watch, or if this was who he had always been. A man who wanted to be a Stark so badly that he would sacrifice everything. A bastard playing at lordship. Winter raged outside, stalling any immediate marches. The realm was locked in stasis, as though waiting for a final act. Jon found days slipping away in a haze of duty, organizing patrols, dealing with disputes among the men, comforting frightened small folk huddled in the corners of the great hall. At night, he often walked the ramparts, lost in thought, the northern sky a curtain of stars above him. Ghost followed, ever faithful. The thought of fighting Robb lay heavy on him, but with each new day, he accepted that it might be inevitable. He tried to cling to some shred of purpose. If they could stave off the chaos, maybe the North would endure. Maybe that was better than letting the Bolton Flayers or the Ironborn Reavers tear it apart. Then, without warning, a fresh raven arrived, battered by storms. The news was grim. Robb had moved north from Riverrun, evading Lannister forces by a night march, rallying what remained of his loyal bannermen. He was crossing the Neck, braving harsh conditions to make for Moat Cailin. The letter implied he would press on to Winterfell. He was coming home, and with him came what remained of his outraged northern host, eager to oust any pretender from their seat. War was coming to Winterfell again, brother against brother. Jon read the letter in silence, the words of the messenger echoing in his mind. He could feel the tension thrumming through Winterfell as men scrambled to prepare defenses. Stannis was not alarmed. He had the advantage of position, and the castle walls were under his control. He had a smaller force, but they were well-trained and disciplined. Moreover, many of the local lords had cast their lot with him. If Robb truly marched in winter, half his men might starve or freeze before reaching them. A fool's errand, Stannis declared. But Jon knew the North. He knew the fierce loyalty Robb commanded among those who still believed in him. He also knew the land's hidden paths, the grit of men who had survived countless harsh winters. Robb would not come unprepared. And so, as the snow fell heavier and the wind howled around Winterfell's battlements, Jon waited with pounding heart for the final test of his choices. What would happen when Robb arrived? Would the great halls of Winterfell run red with Stark blood? Or would fate and winter conspire to carve a new path? Jon did not know. He only knew that he was committed now, committed to a course that had cut him off from all he had once known of honor. In the darkest hour before dawn, as the last watch ended, Jon stood at the ramparts again. Ghost at his side, he peered into the swirling snow, half expecting to see an army materializing from the whiteness. He thought of the old gods, the silent watchers in the godwood. He thought of his father's words on the execution ground so many years ago. He thought of Robb's laugh as they raced across the courtyard. All those ghosts were here, swirling with the snow. The wind carried no comfort, only a whisper of what might have been. Jon bowed his head, gripping the cold stone. Beyond the walls, winter reigned, and somewhere in that frozen expanse, Robb marched with vengeance in his heart. Jon Snow, no, Jon Stark closed his eyes. He whispered into the wind, though he doubted any god would answer. If there is any honor left in me, he said hoarsely, let it guide me now. The wind howled back, indifferent. And so Jon stood, hand resting on Ghost's fur, waiting for the dawn that might bring his brother's wrath, the dawn that could plunge the North into a fresh horror of blood. He had sought power to save his people, but the cost of that choice might be more than he could bear. Winterfell loomed around him, silent stone, a testament to the age-old words of his house, winter is coming. Jon was no stranger to the bitter cold, but in these last few days before Robb Stark's rumored arrival, Winterfell's chill felt different. Anxious tension clung to every wall, every stairwell, every breath of wind. He felt it in the glances of the northern folk who had taken shelter in the castle, in the hushed voices of Stannis' men as they repaired ramparts or checked arrow supplies. A siege in the heart of winter, waged by northerners against northerners, was a cruelty Jon had never imagined he would be part of. Yet here he was, standing in a place he used to call home, wearing the name Stark in truth, but feeling more like an exile than ever. On the 6th day after word came that Robb had crossed the Neck, snow began falling in heavy sheets, transforming the landscape into a swirling white haze. Jon stood on the ramparts with Ser Justin Massey and a cluster of Baratheon soldiers peering out as far as the storm allowed. Beyond the walls, the world was barely visible. The old farmland and forests that once marked Winterfell's surroundings were blanketed in drifts that rose higher by the hour. A scouting party had gone out 2 days ago to glean the size of Robb's forces, but the storm swallowed them, forcing their return with only fragments of intelligence. They might be days away. They might be closer, Ser Justin murmured, his breath steaming as he squinted into the snow. Between the wind and the drifts, the king in the north could be upon us before we even know. Jon nodded. He wore thick gloves and a fur-lined cloak, the gray of the Starks over black ringmail. Yet no matter how many layers he used, the cold seemed to pierce his bones. Are the outer defenses set? As well as they can be, Ser Justin said. We've got watchers on the walls day and night, signal fires ready. Runners with horns in case any large force is sighted within bowshot. Jon peered down into the courtyard. A pair of Stannis' knights shoveled snow away from the main thoroughfare while a group of ragged northern peasants carried firewood toward the keep. The once bustling training yard lay quiet, its training posts encased in ice. Strange how in times of war, a fortress teemed with the hush of fear rather than the din of normal life. A wind gust flung snow against Jon's face. He blinked it away, heart pounding with a silent dread. He had steeled himself for a confrontation with Robb, but the closer it drew, the more it felt like a nightmare without end. He pressed his lips together, recalling the day Stannis had named him Jon Stark. It felt both recent and a lifetime ago. By choosing a crown over his brother's cause, he had set himself on this path. He had done it to protect the North, or so he told himself, to unite it under a stable hand rather than gamble on Robb's uncertain fortunes. Yet, as he looked out at the swirling snow, he felt the weight of regrets piling higher than any snowdrift. Even if he succeeded, if Stannis bested Robb once and for all, where would that leave Jon? Ruling a seat haunted by betrayal and ghosts? His reverie broke when he heard a low growl. Ghost had padded up behind him, silent as snowfall. The direwolf peered over the ramparts, ears pricked and eyes focused. "What is it, boy?" Jon asked softly, crouching to run a hand through Ghost's thick fur. The wolf said nothing, of course, but Jon sensed Ghost's tension as if the beast could smell the approach of an old friend turned enemy. Ser Justin cast a wary glance at Ghost. Then, with a muttered farewell, he descended the steps to check on the men below. Jon stood a moment longer, searching the horizon. Nothing but white. After a time, he followed, boots echoing on the stone steps. Within Winterfell's corridors, torches spluttered, sending shadows dancing along the damp walls. The old castle smelled of cold stone and the distant tang of wood smoke. He made his way to the great hall where Stannis held court over the disordered remains of the castle's leadership. Several local lords or their stewards had taken up residence in half-repaired chambers, forced to rub elbows with Baratheon bannermen from the south. The tension between them was obvious. He stepped into the hall, passing through the tall doors that once felt so grand in his childhood. Now they seemed austere, as if stripped of warmth and memory. At the high table, Stannis was conferring with Davos Seaworth and a small group of knightly officers. A ragged collection of map scraps lay spread across the table's scarred surface. Most were half-ruined. No cartographers in the north had anticipated a winter arrival for war. The men all looked up as Jon approached, though Stannis did not pause his conversation. His face was a study in grim resolve, brows drawn, jaw set. "We must hold our lines here, here, and here," Stannis was saying, tapping at rough sketches of the roads around Winterfell. "If the boy attempts a direct assault in the snow, he'll lose half his men to the elements before they ever reach our walls. Still, we can't underestimate Stark cunning." Jon swallowed. "Your Grace." "Any new word from the scouts?" Stannis shook his head. "None. We sent out another party at dawn, but this storm has likely pinned them down." He SPO. Calmly, yet a flicker of annoyance crossed his eyes. "Your brother plays a dangerous game, marching in these conditions. But it may be his only way to catch us unprepared." Davos offered Jon a sympathetic glance. "Have the castle defenses been checked?" "Yes. The men are doing what they can," Jon replied. "We have ample arrows and oil for the ramparts, though not as much as we'd like." Stannis nodded curtly, scanning the men around him. "Then see to it that if Robb Stark does appear, we respond swiftly. I will not have him slipping men through any side gate or sally port." He dismissed them with a wave. Jon lingered, uncertain if there was more to discuss. But Stannis was already turning back to the table, talking in low tones with Davos. So Jon took his leave, heading for the corridor. The throng of lords and soldiers parted around him, some with respect, some with veiled distrust. They recognized him as Lord Jon Stark, but did not truly know him. Perhaps they never would. He passed a cluster of Serwyn men near the back of the hall. A grizzled fighter bowed his head respectfully, murmuring, "My lord." Jon managed a tight smile. Each acknowledgement made the coil in his belly twist tighter. Outside, the snow fell unabated. Men came and went with slouched shoulders, bearing news of the mounting drifts. Livestock in the stables had to be slaughtered for food if they could no longer be fed. Bread rations shrank. Grumbling turned to desperation. Jon ordered the distribution of what supplies remained in the storehouses, mindful that they might face a siege themselves if Robb encircled the castle. The entire region was locked in nature's grip. Even in victory, winter was the only true conqueror. That afternoon, a horn blast echoed across the ramparts. Jon felt his chest seize. He rushed to the nearest staircase, cloak flapping behind him, ghost close at his side. By the time he emerged on the wall walk, the horn's call was fading, replaced by frantic shouts. Up on the battlements, watchers pointed through the white gloom. There, one man yelled, "Movement in the trees." Jon pressed against the parapet, eye straining. Through the swirling veil of snow, he could just make out dark shapes shifting near the edge of the Wolf's Wood, maybe half a mile distant. It could be a scouting party or the vanguard of Robb's host. Another horn blast rang out, more urgent this time. Jon's heart pounded. If Robb truly had arrived, would he strike immediately or seek to parley? He was about to call for the men to ready the archers when a voice bellowed from below, "Riders approaching." Jon pivoted, nearly slipping on the icy stones, and hurried down a ladder to the courtyard. Sentries at the gate peered through a narrow opening. Outside, a small company of riders had emerged from the whiteness. They carried torches, their shapes hunched against the cold, cloaks stiff with ice. No one wore visible banners, at least not in the swirling snow. But the lead rider raised a hand as if to signal peace. Stannis arrived moments later, flanked by men with drawn swords. "Hold," he commanded, voice echoing off the courtyard walls. "Who approaches?" From beyond the gate came a muffled shout. "We come under a banner of truce. We carry words from the king in the north." A hush fell. Jon felt his breath hitch. The king in the north. Once, that name would have filled him with pride, knowing it was Robb. Now it only caused the old guilt to flare. He exchanged a quick glance with Stannis, who stood rigid as a statue. Then Stannis barked to the guards, "Open the sally port. Let them in, but disarm them." The smaller side gate grated open just enough to admit the riders. Guardsmen in Baratheon sigils quickly surrounded them, demanding their weapons. The visitors surrendered swords, bows, and daggers, pulling back hoods that revealed pale faces half frostbitten by the journey. Jon thought they looked exhausted, half dead from cold. One of them, a tall man with a heavy beard, stepped forward, face pinched with the beginnings of frost in his eyebrows. "I am Hallis Malin," the bearded man said, his breath pluming. Jon recognized the name. Malin had been a loyal master-at-arms in service to House Stark. He had once helped instruct Rickon in handling a wooden sword, back when Rickon was barely old enough to hold one. Hallis's gaze flickered over Jon, and the recognition in his eyes was immediate. For a fleeting moment, disbelief overshadowed everything else. Then his lips tightened. Stannis stood at Jon's side, eyes narrowed. "Speak, then, for your king." Hallis cleared his throat. "We came with an offer. King Robb does not wish to see Winterfell destroyed. He knows it is in the hands of outsiders, but he also knows that a man claiming the name Stark stands here." He looked directly at Jon, and the pain in his eyes cut deeper than any sword could have. "We are charged to propose a meeting, a parley, between the king in the north and Lord Jon Stark." The courtyard seemed to hold its breath. Snow drifted in lazy spirals around them. Stannis's men, uncertain how to respond, looked to their king. Jon found himself fighting to speak. At last he said, "A parley." "Aye," Hallis replied. "Robb, King Robb, bids you come, or else he will come to you. But he thinks it better if you speak on open ground, beyond the walls. He wants to avoid slaughter in Ned Stark's halls, if it can be helped." Stannis's voice broke in, cold and cutting. "He wants to draw us out of our defenses, more like." Hallis's jaw set. "We risked our lives in this storm to deliver the message. If we meant treachery, we could have attempted it another way. All we ask is that you, Lord Jon Stark, come with a small escort. The king in the north will do the same, on neutral ground, so you may talk. If you refuse," he lifted his chin, "if you refuse, Robb Stark will lay siege. He won't rest until Winterfell is restored." Jon could sense Stannis' building ire. The king in the narrow sea had not come this far to be threatened by a boy. Yet Stannis seemed to hold his tongue, waiting for Jon to speak. Slowly, Jon turned to Hallis. "Robb requests I come alone, or near enough?" Hallis nodded. He said, "Bring whomever you trust, but only a handful, else it's no true parley." "Where?" Jon forced himself to continue, though his throat felt tight. "In a clearing just south of the Broken Tower. Perhaps a half-mile from the main gates," Hallis said. "He'll set camp there tomorrow if the weather allows." Stannis let out a bark of laughter. "Tomorrow? Is the boy mad? He marches in a blizzard and expects us to meet him in the snow like fools." Hallis met Stannis' glare. "He's not mad. He's desperate to reclaim his home and end this false claim. Jon's cheeks burned. Hallis was speaking to Stannis, but the words were meant for him. The bitterness there was unmistakable. "You have stolen your brother's seat," the eyes seemed to say. "You wear the name Stark, but you are no Stark." Jon ground his teeth. "If I agree," he said quietly, "he'll guarantee safe passage?" "With the gods as witnesses," Hallis replied. "He will. You have our oath." Silence stretched, broken only by the wind. Stannis looked ready to refuse outright, but Davos, who had arrived in the courtyard, put a hand on the king's elbow. Davos spoke softly, "Your Grace, maybe it's worth hearing what the Boy King says. If we can avoid a full-scale battle in the dead of winter, we should consider it." Stannis's lips tightened, clearly displeased at being urged toward caution. But he was no fool. The risk of a drawn-out siege in the heart of winter was monstrous for both sides. Finally, he gave a single curt nod. "Very well. We'll discuss. Hallis Malin, you and your men will remain here as guests for now. My men will see you fed. If any of you step out of line or attempt sabotage, you'll lose your heads." Hallis inclined his head in acceptance, though the tension in his eyes did not fade. Stannis turned to the guards. "Escort them to quarters and set men at the doors. Double watch. Let no one move about unguarded." The guards obeyed, leading Hallis and the others away. The courtyard emptied until only Stannis, Jon, Davos, and a handful of high-ranking knights remained, along with Ghost lurking near Jon's side. Stannis stared at Jon, a flicker of expectation in his gaze. "What say you, Lord Stark? Will you meet your brother in the snow?" Jon inhaled, lungs burning with cold. "If it might spare Winterfell another storm of blood." "I'll meet him." Stannis turned from Jon to Davos, scanning the yard. "We'll go, but not alone. I'll not leave my newly minted Warden of the North vulnerable to the boy's sword. I'm coming to that parley." Jon's chest tightened. That meant the possibility of confrontation right there on the field. "Your Grace," Robb specifically asked. "I know what he asked," Stannis said brusquely. "We'll honor the limit of a small escort, but I'll be with you. I have no intention of letting you slip away to rejoin your brother." The words stung, but Jon forced himself to remain composed. "As you will." Stannis wasted no more time. "Davos, we'll take no more than 20 men. Find us a suitable corps of knights. Jon, you'll come with me and you'll do the talking. Let's see how far we get before your brother draws steel." Jon dipped his head in a nod, though his stomach coiled in dread. The parley might avert a larger battle, or it might be the first spark of an even deadlier clash. One way or another, by tomorrow, he would see Robb again. The thought made his heart pound with equal parts fear and longing. They parted ways. Jon sought the relative solitude of his father's old solar, a cramped room with a narrow window that overlooked the courtyard. There he sank into a chair, running a hand over his face. Ghost settled at his feet. The wooden desk before him was still engraved with small scratches from Ned Stark's quill and ink, from when Ned had drawn up rosters and arranged lordly appointments. Jon could almost see his father's shape behind the desk, kindly and stern. "If you had lived, father, would any of this have happened?" He let his gaze drift to the hearth, where embers glowed faintly. The new caretaker had lit a small fire in the solar to keep the chill at bay, but it did little to banish the gloom. Jon's reflection appeared on the window's surface like a phantom, half illuminated by the weak firelight. 1,000 half-formed thoughts clawed at him. How would Robb greet him? With fury or sadness? Was there any hope of forging peace? He dozed fitfully that night, ghostly dreams twisting through his mind. He saw himself and Robb racing each other in the yard, laughing, until the laughter turned to screams and the yard flooded with blood. He dreamt of direwolves locked in a savage fight, jaws snapping, snow stained red around their paws. He jolted awake more than once, heart hammering. Each time he would lie still, listening to the muffled whine of the wind outside. Then, in the gray gloom before dawn, he rose and dressed, strapping on a black brigandine beneath his Stark cloak. The moment of truth had come. Stannis and his chosen knights gathered in the courtyard as the light grew. Snow still fell, though less fiercely, turning the world into a gray-white haze. Davos was there, his face set in a mix of concern and resolve. Melisandre hovered near the edges of the group, her red robes startling against the snow. Jon met her gaze once, but she said nothing, merely bowed her head slightly as if to wish him well, or to mark him for whatever fate the flames had shown her. They rode out from Winterfell's gates, a column of about 20. Stannis and Davos at the head, with Jon on Stannis' left. Ghost padded behind, treading almost soundlessly. The wind cut across them, flinging stinging flakes into their faces. It was quiet but for the rustle of snow-laden branches. Jon found himself gripping the reins of his horse too tightly. The north gate behind them closed, the heavy portcullis grinding shut. The journey to the broken tower clearing was short, but each step felt like a final approach to a battlefield. The snowdrifts reached nearly to the horses' knees in places, forcing them to proceed slowly. Occasionally, a knight or two had to dismount to help free a trapped animal. No one spoke except to mutter curses about the cold. At last, through the pale gloom, Jon saw dark shapes in the clearing. A ring of torches, barely flickering in the wind, formed a perimeter. There were men behind those torches, Robb's men, presumably. Jon's heart pounded in his ears. He caught glimpses of a standard, the gray direwolf of House Stark, snapping in the wind. For a moment, he felt an odd, yearning pride at the sight. It was his house's sigil, after all, though he wore the name by law rather than by birth. Then the reality of the situation sank in like a stone. Those men would kill him if Robb commanded it, no matter how many direwolves were embroidered on his cloak. Stannis made a motion for his company to halt. "We dismount," he said, voice taut. "We'll approach on foot, so there's no confusion about drawn swords. Davos, remain here with half the knights. Jon, come with me, and choose a few men for your guard if you wish." Jon swallowed. "I'll take Ser Justin and 2 others," he said. He almost wanted to leave them all behind, to face Robb alone, but that would be folly. If violence broke out, he would need them. And Ghost. He swung down from his horse, boots crunching in deep snow. His heart thundered as he led Ghost forward. Stannis and 4 of his personal guards came behind, accompanied by Davos at a few paces distance. They trudged toward the ring of torches. On the far side, Jon could make out perhaps a dozen men. A tall figure stood at the center, cloaked in wolf gray and black, posture erect. Robb Stark. Jon's mouth felt suddenly dry. He advanced until perhaps 20 feet of snowy ground separated them from Robb's group. He could see the watchers on the perimeter, each with a hand on the hilt of a sword or an axe. He recognized a few faces, young lords who had once feasted with Robb at Winterfell. Now, they regarded Jon with a mixture of scorn and heartbreak. Robb himself stepped forward. The snow caught in his auburn hair, now grown longer, and a short beard framed his jaw. His eyes were a cold blue, locked on Jon. Behind him stood several sworn swords and bannermen. Jon glimpsed the black iron of House Umber, the forest green of certain Hornwood men. Hallis Malin stood there too, battered from the journey. And near Robb's shoulder, a great gray direwolf prowled. Gray Wind, bigger than Ghost by half. The beast bared its teeth in a silent snarl, hackles raised at the sight of Jon's white wolf. Ghost stiffened beside Jon, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Robb drew a breath, exhaling fog in the cold air. "So the rumors are true," he said, voice tense and resonant in the hush. "You have taken Winterfell, and with it the Stark name. My father's seat, worn by a bastard who bends the knee to another king." Jon felt each word like a lash. He wanted to speak, but could not find his voice. For a moment, memories of their youth flooded him. Sparring with wooden swords, slipping out of the castle to fish in the streams, laughing over mead they stole from the kitchens. Gone. That was all gone now. Stannis took a step forward, reasserting his own presence. "I am Stannis of House Baratheon, rightful king of Westeros. Your half-brother has been named Lord Jon Stark by my decree. We are here to negotiate, not to trade insults." Robb did not even glance at Stannis. His eyes remained fixed on Jon. "Negotiate? There's no negotiation to be had. You've seized my home, killed men loyal to me." Jon finally managed to speak, his words hoarse with emotion he struggled to master. "Robb, the men who claimed Winterfell before us were Bolton turncloaks and Ironborn reavers. You know what Theon did. You know what the Boltons did. We freed our father's castle from those traitors." His voice tightened. "I had no wish to spill loyal Stark blood. The war forced her hand. Robb's lip curled. So you align yourself with the man who calls himself king when you know full well our father's wishes. Our father never wanted the North to break from the realm, Jon said, though the statement tasted bitter. He served King Robert faithfully. The North is part of the Seven Kingdoms. I stand with the rightful king to protect our lands from ruin. A storm flickered across Robb's features. Our father is dead because of southern treachery. Joffrey sits the Iron Throne, a Lannister puppet. When the Northern Lords declared me king in the North, it was to avenge father and defend ourselves from the Vipers in King's Landing. Now you side with Stannis instead. Is that truly how you think we save the North? Jon's pulse hammered. He could feel the eyes of both sides watching this exchange, the crackling torches, the hush of falling snow. Robb, the realm is shattered. One war after another. I swore my vows to the Night's Watch, but that vow alone couldn't stop the forces that threatened our home. I was forced to make a choice. He glanced at Stannis, who stood with stony impatience. Stannis came to the wall, fought to save the Watch from the wildling invasion. You might have chosen your brother, Robb snapped. Your true brother, not the man who would be king. If you wanted to save the North, you could have joined me. We could have fought together. But you wanted your father's seat for yourself, didn't you? The accusation cut deeper than the cold. Jon's cheeks burned. That isn't why. I only wanted to see the North united before the real threat arrives from beyond the wall. The White Walkers, the others, they're real, Robb. I've seen them. Once winter truly sets in, they'll come. And if we're divided, we'll fall. Robb's knuckles whitened around the hilt of his sword. I don't deny the dangers of the far north. But this arrangement you've made has torn the North in two, maybe three or four, counting the lords you haven't brought to heel. You think that's unity? He glared at Stannis. We will never accept a southern king who demands we kneel just after my father was killed by southern swords. Stannis, who had been silent thus far, took a step forward, boots sinking in the snow. Your father was killed by the Lannisters, he said coolly. I was Robert's heir, and I mean to see justice done. You, Robb Stark, are no king. You are a usurper who has cost the realm thousands of lives in a feudal war. Bend the knee and I will name you Warden of the Trident or give you fair lands in the Riverlands. The North belongs to Jon Stark, my rightful warden who holds Winterfell. That is the only compromise I'll offer. Robb's eyes flicked to Stannis, finally, and in them Jon saw a swirling blend of hatred and incredulity. You know nothing of the North, Stannis Baratheon. You think you can buy our loyalty with promises of land? If I bent the knee to you, it would be betrayal of every man who followed me out of loyalty to my father's memory. The men who followed you out of loyalty to Eddard Stark are the same men who cry out for an end to this war, Stannis retorted. You've lost the phrase, lost half your alliances. The Karstarks turned on you. I executed Lord Rickard Karstark for murdering Lannister prisoners. His men left me because they cared more for revenge than honor. Stannis sniffed dismissively. Regardless, you're weakened with few southern alliances remaining. You cannot withstand me. If you truly love your people, you will yield. A hush fell. Snow swirled. Gray winds snarled softly, and ghostry turned the sound low and menacing. Jon felt a dizzying tension rising. The chance of a peaceful settlement was slipping away, replaced by a confrontation that might end in drawn swords. He took a step forward, lifting his hands in a placating gesture. Robb, please. Listen to me, Jon said quietly. We don't have to fight. If you give up your claim to be king in the North, you can still maintain your father's legacy. The North is more than a crown. It's the people, the families. We can't keep spilling blood. Silence. Robb shouted. His voice cracked, revealing the hurt beneath the fury. You speak of my father's legacy, yet you hold his castle in the name of a stranger? You're the one who spilled northern blood. You chose to break faith with me. You broke faith with father. Do not lecture me about unity. Jon felt the words like a physical blow. For a moment, he couldn't speak. He recalled the day they parted, the promises they made to reunite after the war. The memory twisted in his mind like a knife. Robb, he whispered, I never meant to betray you. Robb's throat bobbed, and for a heartbeat, sorrow flickered in his eyes. Then steel replaced it. Yet here you stand, wearing the Stark name as if you earned it. A name bestowed on you by a man who has no right to it. He threw a scornful glance at Stannis. I'll not yield. Winterfell is mine by birth, and I will take it back. Stannis let out a breath that steamed in the cold. Then you are a fool, Robb Stark. My patience is ended. He flicked a hand, and two of his knights stepped forward, though they did not draw their blades yet. We'll give you one final chance. Surrender and come to court in chains if you must. Or else die in the snows outside your father's walls. Gray Wind bared his teeth, growling. Robb's men bristled, some stepping closer to their king. Hallis Malin put a hand on his sword hilt, wariness and readiness crossing his face. The clearing filled with the hush of men bracing for an explosion of violence. Jon's heart hammered so loud it seemed to echo. He looked between Robb and Stannis, seeing no easy path to peace. Robb's voice quivered with controlled rage. "We are done talking." Stannis nodded once, grim as a headsman. "So be it." He gestured to his guards. "We're leaving." Jon found himself rooted to the spot. He wanted to reach out, to beg Robb to change his mind, or to ask for a private word. Anything. But the conviction in Robb's stance, in his set jaw, told Jon it was pointless. The king in the north would not yield to Stannis, not after all he had sacrificed. Jon opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Robb glared at him, eyes full of betrayal, before turning away. Gray wind padded after him, hackles still raised. In a matter of moments, the meeting ended. Stannis and his men withdrew toward their mounts, the torches of Robb's men flickering as the swirling snow swallowed their shapes. Jon followed in a daze, Ghost at his heels, hardly noticing the stinging cold. Stannis barked an order for the men to be ready for battle within a day's time. Robb would not wait. The storm was diminishing, and once it cleared, he would strike. Or perhaps he would attempt a siege. Either way, war was coming to Winterfell's gates. Back at the castle, the mood was tense, teetering on the brink. Word spread quickly of the failed parley. Jon gave no speeches. He merely oversaw the preparations, ensuring archers were assigned vantage points on the walls, that the gates were reinforced, that the storehouses were inventoried. He tried not to think of the men in Robb's camp who were once his friends, or of the day they had parted in Winterfell's courtyard when they were still boys. But memory was inescapable. Every corner of the castle whispered of older days, simpler days. Now they awaited the arrival of an army commanded by the last living brother Jon had loved. Stannis convened a war council in the great hall by torchlight. The men huddled in furs, the air thick with tension and the smell of stale cooking grease. Melisandre stood in a corner, her presence like a crimson shadow. She said little, only watching with an intensity that made Jon's skin prickle. "The boy will come soon," Stannis declared, eyes scanning the knights and lesser lords around him. "He can't afford a long siege. His supplies will run out fast in this snow, and his men are not well provisioned. We hold the castle and the advantage." A younger knight coughed. "Might he try a night assault?" Stannis snorted. "Let him. My men will be ready on the walls. The fools who try to climb them in the dark will fall and break their necks." Davos nodded grimly. "A siege could drag on, though, your grace. We might be better supplied than him, but we're not flush with food either. This winter is unrelenting. If his men make some camp around Winterfell, we could be locked in a stalemate, starving us both." "I say we sally out," Ser Justin proposed. "Meet them in the field. Their numbers can't be that large. We'd have surprise on our side if we choose the time." "No," Stannis said. "The castle is our best advantage. We're fewer and we have walls. Let him break himself against Winterfell's gates." Jon, who stood off to the side, finally spoke. "If we force an open battle, we risk the destruction of the farmland that remains. The small folk suffer more. Winterfell could be damaged further." He hesitated. "I know it seems impossible, but maybe we can." Stannis shot him a cold glare. "We tried parley, Jon Stark." He refused all terms. Jon swallowed and fell silent. Yes, they had tried, but it had been a meeting doomed before it began. He sensed that both sides were too proud, too wounded to yield. For all his regrets, it seemed this path was set. When the council ended, the men dispersed. Jon stood there, staring at the flickering torches that cast dancing shadows on the high stone walls. He was tired, so very tired. If he left with Ghost, fled north, would it solve anything? No. Robb would press on. Stannis would fight. The blood would still spill. He felt a soft touch on his arm. Turning, he found himself face to face with Melisandre, her red hair an uncanny blaze in the glow of the torches. "You are troubled, Lord Stark," she said in her low, almost musical voice. "The flames show me your torment. You stand at a crossroads of destiny. He exhaled, forcing calm. I'm done with talk of prophecies. You may be done with them, but they are not done with you, she replied, eyes gleaming. A terrible night approaches, Jon Snow. Or Jon Stark, if you prefer. The White Walkers stir, and the bloodshed in Winterfell is but a pale herald of the wars to come. In the darkest night, only the flames of the Lord of Light can guide us. Jon tried to keep his voice level. I don't share your faith. No matter. She offered a small, almost pitying smile. Faith or not, you have a role to play. Perhaps once the snows melt, you'll see what that role is. For now, you must do what you must. If the king in the north will not yield, he'll leave you no choice. She turned and left in a swirl of crimson cloth, leaving Jon feeling more adrift than before. 1,000 conflicting thoughts warred in his mind, but the War Council's verdict was clear: stand firm, let Robb come. The next few days were a frantic haze of final fortifications. Archers tested vantage points, while Baratheon knights prepared cauldrons of oil to pour from the battlements. The small folk huddled in the inner wards. Old Glovermen and Serwyn men formed squads to patrol the courtyard. The castle blacksmith hammered out last-minute repairs to armor and swords. At times, Jon saw glimpses of the old life, men stoking fires in the great hearth, the clang of steel on anvils. But always, the undercurrent of fear pulsed. By the time the storm cleared fully, Winterfell was as ready as it could be. The day dawned gray, the sky heavy with clouds, but the howling winds had receded, leaving an eerie hush over the land. Scouts peered from watchtowers. By midday, they saw the first sign of Robb's approach. Dark lines on the horizon, the movement of men emerging from the wolfswood in disciplined formations. Jon stood on the ramparts, heart hammering as he glimpsed the banners flapping in the distance. He recognized the dire wolf standard, and behind it the sigils of various northern houses that had remained true to Robb: Tallheart, Mormont, some scattered umbers. Their numbers were not as great as they once had been, but still formidable. He heard calls down the line: they're forming up. Archers, ready yourselves. The tension was suffocating. A horn blast from Robb's lines called out across the snowy fields. Jon watched from the wall. The watchers near him murmured that the king in the north might send one more envoy or might attempt a formation to draw them out. But no fresh envoy appeared. Instead, Robb's army began to advance. Slow, steady, purposeful. The swirl of their footsteps stirred up the snow in ghostly clouds. Stannis emerged onto the battlements, flanked by knights in Baratheon colors. They come, he said, voice carrying. Hold your positions. Let them try the gates if they wish. Archers, wait for the signal. Jon's breath came quick and shallow. Ghost paced along the walkway, agitated by the mass of men below. From this vantage, Jon could see the field of white between Winterfell's walls and the first outlying stands of trees. Robb's host was moving in loose ranks, as if searching for a weak point. Jon spotted cavalry on the flanks, though the deep snowdrifts would hamper a charge. Then, from the midst of Robb's lines, a line of archers stepped forward. They loosed a volley of arrows, arching dark against the gray sky. Most fell short of the walls, but a handful clattered against the stone. A show of force, a test. Stannis lifted a hand. Archers, answer, he commanded. A volley flew from Winterfell's ramparts. Jon winced, imagining the men below raising shields against the hail. War had come. He gritted his teeth, reminding himself that it was Robb who had advanced, that Stannis held the rightful claim. But his heart was heavy as lead. Robb's men pressed closer. Stannis barked more orders. He directed men to reinforce the main gate in case they attempted to ram it or climb it. For a while, the engagement was limited to arrow volleys. Men fell on both sides, pinned by cold steel in the snow. Jon watched, feeling physically ill, as archers along the parapets loosed shaft after shaft. He glimpsed motion at the flanks, some of Robb's riders attempting to move around the castle walls, perhaps to find a postern gate. But they were stymied by the deep drifts, easy targets for Winterfell's watchers. Then a thunderous crash rang out. Robb's men had dragged forward a crude battering ram, hammered together from felled trees. They hurled themselves at the outer gate, the old oak planks shuddering with each strike. Archers above poured arrows down on them, while a handful of men dropped hot oil. Screams split the air. Jon peered over the edge, flinching as he saw the carnage. One battered soldier, arm ablaze, staggered through the snow, shrieking. This was the reality of war. Each second was another coffin nail for men who should have been united against the true terrors of winter. He glimpsed a shape in the chaos below, Robb, astride a horse, directing men with waves of his sword. Gray wind bounded beside him, leaping at defenders who tried to sally forth from a side gate. The direwolf tore a man down in seconds. Jon's chest constricted. Each heartbeat hammered. This is my brother. This is my doing. The gates held for a time, but the repeated pounding took a toll. Wood splintered. Stannis watched from the ramparts, his gaze cold. "Send the reserve to the courtyard," he told Davos. "If they break through, we close the inner gate and trap them." Jon felt the wind whip his cloak as he turned to run for the courtyard. He could not stand idle. He descended the main stairwell at a run, Ghost racing beside him, and found the courtyard in confusion. Baratheon men rushed about, dragging sharpened stakes into position, forming a half-barricade. Northern volunteers, from Serwyn and Glover, stood with swords, pikes, and makeshift spears. Their faces showed terror and grim resolve. The battered main gate shuddered with each impact. Splinters rained from the overhead timbers. Jon felt the vibrations in his chest. "Shore up that brace," a knight yelled. Another crash, louder than before, and part of the gate gave way. A ragged hole splintered open, wide enough for a man to squeeze through. At once, defenders rushed to seal it with spear points, but men outside heaved and hacked at the wood. A moment later, the gate caved in with a groan, and a flood of steel and fury poured through. The defenders braced, the courtyard erupting into chaos. Jon found himself swept up in the melee. A northern man in chainmail lunged at him, sword raised. Jon barely had time to parry before Ghost darted forward, snarling, forcing the attacker to scramble back. Another soldier crashed in from the side, brandishing an axe. Jon ducked, feeling the rush of air as the blade whistled overhead. He countered with a thrust that caught the man in the thigh. The soldier collapsed, crying out. The courtyard became a swirling madness of bodies, steel, and screams. Amid the chaos, Jon caught glimpses of battered Stark sigils on some of the invaders. They must have been men who had stuck with Robb from the beginning, men who still believed fervently in the king in the north. Now they were locked in mortal combat with their own countrymen, loyal to a different side. The horror of it churned Jon's stomach. For every invader that fell, more seemed to press through the demolished gate. Jon realized they were attempting to open the castle fully to allow Robb's main force inside. He gritted his teeth, adrenaline surging. He had to hold them back. He glimpsed Ser Justin rallying a group of defenders near the stables, trying to cut off an approaching wedge of Robb's men. Screams rang out as horses reared, the stench of blood thick in the air. Through the swirling snow and the press of bodies, Jon heard a fierce roar. Suddenly, gray wind exploded into the courtyard, bearing down on a group of Baratheon soldiers. The huge dire wolf slashed with savage power, sending men sprawling. One tried to swing at the beast, but gray wind moved like a blur, jaws clamping on the man's arm. The soldier shrieked. The next moment, gray wind had darted away, blood dripping from his muzzle. Panic rippled through Stannis' men. Jon's eyes flicked around, searching for Robb. If gray wind was here, Robb could not be far. He found him astride a horse that had just charged through the gate, scattering defenders. Robb swung a longsword as he rode, forging a path deeper into the courtyard. Several Baratheon spearmen formed a bristling line, trying to bring the horse down. Robb wheeled his mount away at the last moment, demonstrating a horseman's skill that left Jon breathless. Even in the madness, he recognized that Robb was every inch a battlefield commander shaped by the wars in the south. Jon struggled through the press, intent on reaching Robb, if there was any chance to halt the slaughter. But the fight surged around him. A young Northman lunged at Jon with a cry of "For King Robb." Their blades clashed, ringing out in the cold air. Jon parried once, twice, felt the sting of an impact glancing off his shoulder. He hissed in pain, ignoring it. Ghost launched himself at the attacker's side, driving the man away from Jon, but the man's companions closed in, forcing Jon to defend himself again. Somehow, Jon fought his way free of the melee, stumbling behind an overturned cart. He caught a glimpse of the main yard, where Stannis' banners still flew. The yard was filling with chaos. The defenders were giving ground, though not yet broken. Stannis himself was nowhere in sight, perhaps still on the walls. Another wave of Robb's men pressed in. Arrows flew from the ramparts above, taking some invaders down, but not enough to stem the tide. A sickening sensation settled in Jon's gut. They might lose Winterfell entirely. The gatehouse was compromised, the courtyard overwhelmed. Unless the defenders rallied quickly, the castle would fall. Then a great crash of steel on steel erupted from the far side of the yard, and Jon spied a band of Baratheon knights surging out of an inner gate. They hit Robb's men in a wedge, scattering them. Jon's hope soared momentarily. Perhaps the defenders had a chance. Then he saw Robb in the midst of the swirl, dismounted now, fighting on foot as his horse had been felled by a spear. Robb was battered but unyielding, cloak-torn and blood-staining his left arm. Grey Wind circled him, fangs bared, guarding his flank. Baratheon knights closed in from the front. Jon's heart lurched. He was caught between old loyalties and new, the memory of brotherhood and the reality of war. In that moment, he knew the only way to keep Robb from being cut down was to face him himself. He pushed forward, weaving through the press, ignoring the swords that swung at him from the side. Ghost kept pace, snapping at foes who drew too near. At last, Jon burst into the small open space around Robb. Two of Stannis' knights lunged for Robb's flank. Without hesitation, Jon rammed one knight with his shoulder, knocking the man off balance. The other knight reeled back, confused. It gave Robb the moment he needed to strike them down. Steel flashed and the knights collapsed. Robb spun, sword up, expecting more attackers. His eyes locked on Jon, and for an instant, time froze. Around them, men hacked and screamed, direwolves snarled, the snow churned red. But in that heartbeat, it was only the two of them. Jon raised his blade. Robb did the same. Neither moved. Grey Wind snarled at Ghost, and Ghost growled in response. The tension between them was a tangible force, a lifetime of shared memories and fresh betrayals compressed into a single breath. Robb's chest heaved as he gazed at Jon. Blood trailed from a gash on his temple, dripping down his cheek. "Jon," he managed, voice raw. "Why did it have to come to this?" Jon's throat tightened. "Stop this. Please. Call off your men. We can find another way." "Another way?" Robb barked a laugh that held no humor. "Is there another way to reclaim my home from you and your southern king?" "Winterfell belongs to House Stark," Jon said desperately, "and I am a Stark. No. Not like this," Robb hissed. "I'll never surrender to you. Too much blood has been spilled already. Fight me if you have the courage. End this farce." Jon almost lowered his sword. He saw the fierce sorrow in Robb's eyes, the heartbreak of a man who had lost so much. "Robb, I don't want to kill you." Robb clenched his jaw. "Then yield. Step aside, let me take my seat, and perhaps I'll spare your life. We can deal with your King Stannis later." Jon felt as though the entire world teetered on a razor's edge. If he yielded, Stannis' men would call him traitor again. War would continue. But if he fought, he might be forced to kill his own brother. Or die by Robb's hand. In that split second, a swirl of madness raged within him. His vow to the Watch, his vow to Stannis, his vow to the North, the love for his family, all knotted together into a mess of conflict. "I can't," Jon whispered, voice shaking. "I have my duty." The Night's Watch vow. Robb's eyes burned with tears of fury. "You speak of the Night's Watch? You deserted them. Don't dishonor those vows by using them as an excuse now." He tightened his grip on his sword. "Fight me or stand aside. Choose." Jon's vision blurred for an instant as tears of anguish brimmed, threatening to fall. For all their shared memories, for all the nights they had whispered about the future in Winterfell's corridors, that future was shattered now. If he refused to fight, Robb would push on and Stannis' men would bring him down. If he fought, he might stain his soul beyond redemption. Then the choice was made for him. Robb lunged, sword angled for Jon's shoulder. Reflex took over. Jon parried, their blades ringing out, sending jolts up Jon's arm. Ghost and Grey Wind barked and snarled, circling each other. The half-brothers danced through the snow, each stroke echoing the swirl of emotions in their eyes. They had trained together as boys, had sparred 1,000 times under their father's watch, but never like this. Never with lethal intent. They exchanged quick blows. Robb was strong, his sword arm honed by countless battles in the south. Jon was swift, driven by the harsh necessity of the Wall's training. They clashed, parted, clashed again, each time a flurry of sparks or a glint of steel in the pale light. Around them, the courtyard raged, but in Jon's mind, it all faded. Only Robb mattered, this primal confrontation that felt like a betrayal of everything they once stood for. Jon barely blocked a blow aimed at his neck. Robb's blade slid off the parry and nicked Jon's ear, warm blood trickling down. Jon retreated a step, panting. "Robb, don't shut up!" Robb roared, tears in his voice. "You did this, Jon. You forced my hand." He came on again, ferocious. Jon scrambled to defend, feeling each impact jar his bones. Ghost snarled and sprang at Grey Wind, the two dire wolves colliding in a tangle of fur and teeth. A soldier stumbled into the fray and Grey Wind tore out the man's leg in an instant. Jon seized the opening to slash at Robb's sword arm. But Robb twisted, taking only a shallow cut. He countered, forcing Jon to duck. The two circled, breath ragged in the cold air. Every nerve in Jon's body screamed that this was wrong. He should not be raising a blade to his brother. A sudden surge in the melee swept more men between them, momentarily separating the half-brothers. Jon's eyes darted around, frantic. He spotted Robb again, fending off a Baratheon knight who was hacking at him mercilessly. Before Jon could move, the knight found a gap in Robb's defenses and lunged. Robb twisted aside, but not fast enough. The blade stabbed into his left side. Robb let out a cry, toppling to one knee, blood staining the snowy ground. "Robb!" Jon shouted, voice cracking. He sprang forward, driving his sword through the knight's back before the man could land another blow. The knight crumpled with a gasp. Grey Wind, spotting Robb's peril, pounced on the knight's corpse, ripping at it. Robb sagged, clutching his side. All around them, the battle raged on, but in that moment, Jon felt as if the world slowed to a hush. He knelt by Robb, ignoring the swirl of steel and screaming men. Robb's eyes were wide, breath shallow. Blood seeped through his cloak. "Robb," Jon said, voice choked, "stay with me. We can get a maester." Robb's hand caught Jon's wrist in a grip weaker than it once was, but fierce with emotion. His gaze burned with equal parts hatred and heartbreak. "Traitor," he rasped. You betrayed us all." Jon bowed his head, tears streaming now, freezing on his cheeks. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I never wanted." Robb coughed, blood flecking his lips. He tried to speak again, but his breath faltered. His eyes fluttered, and for a moment they seemed to soften as if remembering the old days, two boys in the courtyard, friends, brothers. Then the light faded. His head lolled, breath stilled. Robb Stark, the king in the north, was gone. Jon's world shattered. He pulled Robb's body close, heedless of the chaos around him, of the threat of more enemies. A choked sob tore from his throat. Grey Wind sniffed Robb's face, letting out a piteous whine. Then the great dire wolf rounded on Jon, teeth bared, furious, and confused. Ghost intervened, blocking Grey Wind's snap. The two wolves circled each other in a savage, grief-stricken dance, as if each blamed the other for the death of a master. Jon barely noticed. He clung to Robb, tears dripping onto the blood-stained snow. His half-brother's final word echoed in his mind, "Traitor." Was that truly all that remained between them? The courtyard was bedlam, but around Jon, men began to realize what had happened. Someone cried out, "The king in the north is dead." Others looked on in shock or despair. Some of Robb's men tried to rally, but the news cut the heart from them. Their lines began to break, morale shattered by the loss of their king. Up on the ramparts, Stannis' voice bellowed, "They waver. Press them. Take them or scatter them." More Baratheon knights surged from the interior of the castle, driving the invaders back toward the gates. Some of Robb's men surrendered, dropping weapons in tearful defeat. Others fled, dragging the wounded with them. Within moments, the courtyard's savage battle degenerated into a rout. The survivors scrambled back outside the ruined main gate, some men trudging through ankle-deep gore. Winterfell was lost to them. Their king lay dead in the bloody snow. Jon remained on his knees, oblivious to the swirl of movement. Grey Wind hovered, uncertain, letting out a keening whine. Then the wolf lunged at Jon, but Ghost blocked the attack, jaws clamping on Grey Wind's shoulder. A savage struggle ensued, the two dire wolves tumbling across the snow. Men scrambled out of their path. Jon, dazed, realized that Grey Wind might kill Ghost or be killed himself. Instinct overcame despair. He stood, dropping Robb's lifeless form gently, and waded into the clash. He seized Grey Wind by the fur, trying to pull him back. The beast snarled, turned on Jon, but at the last instant recognized the scent. Grey Wind twisted away, muzzle spattered with blood, a mixture of the knight's and perhaps his own. Ghost snarled, pinned by confusion as much as rage. Then a group of Baratheon soldiers rushed in, swords raised, intent on killing Grey Wind. Jon swung around, shielding the direwolf. "No," he roared. "Leave him be." The soldiers hesitated. Grey Wind, panting and battered, regarded Jon with half-crazed eyes. The castle yard was full of men who hated him for belonging to Robb's side. The wolf let out a trembling growl, glanced at Robb's body on the ground, and then whirled and sprinted through the broken gate. One soldier lifted about to shoot, but Jon struck the bow aside. Grey Wind vanished into the chaos beyond the walls, howling a broken lament. A hush drifted through the courtyard as men realized the battle was over. Robb's banner had fallen. Stannis' men secured the gates once more, forcing any stragglers to either surrender or flee. The outer wards teemed with wounded. Shouts rang out as the defenders took stock of their own dead. Snow fell heavier again, as if the skies wept for the broken house. Jon sank back to his knees beside Robb's body. He pressed a hand to the wound, but it was pointless. Robb's eyes were open, unseeing. Blood stained his handsome features, that once proud visage undone by war. Ghost limped over, muzzle lowered, ears flattened with sorrow. Stannis arrived, pausing amid the carnage. He stared at the still form of Robb Stark. Snow clung to the king in the north's curls, turning them pale. "So the boy is dead," Stannis said quietly, though there was no triumph in his voice. "We have one then. Winterfell remains ours." Jon looked up, hollow-eyed, tears freezing on his cheeks. His sword lay discarded in the bloodied slush. A swirl of fury and despair coalesced in his chest. He wanted to scream at Stannis that this was no victory, that they had broken the North's heart. But words died in his throat. He saw the men behind Stannis, some with grim satisfaction, others with pitying glances. They knew the king in the north was Jon's brother. They saw the devastation etched across Jon's face. "You did what you had to," Stannis said, voice clipped but not unkind. "He gave us no choice, Jon Stark." Jon trembled, staring at Robb's lifeless eyes. He hardly recognized the boy who used to grin at him, praising his swordplay or joking about girls they fancied. Now that laughter was gone forever, replaced by the silent condemnation of an unfulfilled life. He reached out, gently closing Robb's eyes. The courtyard was quiet now, save for the moans of the wounded. Davos approached, urging men to gather the dead. A hush seemed to fall over the watchers as Jon brushed snow from Robb's hair. For an agonizing moment, Jon's mind flickered to the crypts beneath Winterfell. Robb would lie there among their ancestors, Ned Stark's eldest trueborn son, lost to a war that had begun as vengeance for Ned's death. Another Stark gone. Stannis cleared his throat. "Davos, have men gather the bodies of the North's highborn. We'll give them proper rights if that is what they wish. As for Robb Stark's remains, we'll see that it's treated with respect. He was misguided, but he died a warrior's death." Jon murmured. "He was more than that." Stannis's face tightened. Perhaps he sensed Jon's bitterness. "We do what we must," he said again, then turned to coordinate the rest of the cleanup. Men began dragging the dead away, stepping gingerly around the stiffening corpses. The snow kept falling, covering the carnage, as though the land itself wished to hide the horror. Jon scarcely noticed them. He cradled Robb's head, remembering. A kaleidoscope of images swirled in his mind. Robb teasing him at swords, racing him across the courtyard, encouraging him when he felt overshadowed. How could it end like this? Jon closed his eyes, stifling a sob that threatened to tear his chest apart. Everything he'd done was in pursuit of what he thought was right, saving the North from further chaos, forging a path for unity. But in the end, he had destroyed the bond that once meant the most to him. At some point, strong hands urged him up. Serwyn men lifted Robb's body with gentle reverence. Ghost whined, pacing around them. Numbly, Jon rose. The courtyard was all but captured now. A few captives knelt, disarmed, eyes hollow. Others had fled into the wilderness. The battered gate was once again barred, makeshift repairs hastily underway. A cluster of watchers hovered, uncertain how to react to their new Lord Stark. Some gazed on him with pity or horror. Others avoided his eyes, disturbed by the sight of a man kneeling over the body of his own brother. Jon parted from Robb's corpse only after it was laid carefully on a cart, draped with a torn piece of a Stark banner. "He deserves better," Jon mumbled, voice hoarse. "He deserves the tomb of his ancestors." "So he shall have it," offered Davos gently, stepping forward. "We can lay him in the crypts with your father." Jon nodded, swallowing painfully. Yes, do that." His tears had dried, replaced by a hollow ache. A part of him wanted to accompany Robb's body to the crypts immediately, but duty demanded otherwise. Men needed orders, the wounded needed care, and he was Warden of the North by Stannis' decree. Somewhere in the swirl of tasks that followed, organizing the wounded, consoling the traumatized small folk, seeing to the distribution of meager rations, Jon drifted like a man in a dream. He answered questions, gave instructions, but each act felt like a puppet pulled by strings. The ring of steel, the cries of the dying, the image of Robb's pale face haunted him. Over and over, he heard that final word, traitor. Late that night, after the dead were gathered, Jon descended into the crypts of Winterfell. 2 torches lit his way, carried by Serwyn men who accompanied him in solemn silence. The cold stone passage echoed each footstep. The ancient statues loomed on either side, Stark ancestors with stone wolves at their feet, each resting a hand on the hilt of a sword. Eddard Stark's resting place lay deeper within, though no statue yet graced his tomb. Now there would be another. That knowledge made Jon's heart clench. Robb's body had been placed on a stone slab near Ned's tomb. Someone had cleaned the blood from his face. He seemed younger in death, reminiscent of the boy who once teased Jon about being too serious. Jon approached slowly, torch sputtering in the stale air. Ghost slunk at his side, silent as a spirit. A single figure knelt beside Robb's form, a gray-haired woman in dark clothing. Jon recognized her as one of the castle's old servants who had served the Starks for decades. She looked up, eyes wet with grief. "He was always so kind," she murmured, voice trembling. "When he was no more than 8 or 9, I caught him sneaking bread to the kennel pups. Said they were hungry. He was always good, my lord." Jon felt a tear slip down his cheek. "I know," he whispered. "I know." The woman bowed her head and rose, giving Jon a moment of privacy. He carefully set the torch in a sconce, letting its light flicker over Robb's still face. The crypt was silent save for the distant drip of water. Jon inhaled sharply, then knelt, placing a trembling hand on Robb's cold forehead. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice echoing. "I'm so sorry." He closed his eyes, recalling that last day at Winterfell before the war began when they parted ways, Robb, bold and eager to follow his father south, Jon, on the cusp of joining the Night's Watch. They had never imagined the realm would tear itself apart, that they would be set on opposite sides of a war. The silence weighed on him. Eventually, he placed a hand on Robb's chest, feeling the stiff, lifeless armor. "I should have stood by you," he said softly, tears threatening once more. "Or I should have died before it came to this. Father wouldn't have wanted us at each other's throats. And now, he'll never see you grow into the lord you should have been." A surge of overwhelming pain poured through him, strangling his words. He squeezed his eyes shut, struggling not to sob outright. Ghost nudged his shoulder, offering silent comfort. The direwolf had small cuts on his muzzle from the earlier fight with Grey Wind, but the bigger wound was in Jon's heart. Finally, the tears came. He buried his face in his hands, letting them run until he felt hollow. After a time, footsteps approached behind him. He glanced back, seeing Davos Seaworth, carrying a small lantern. The older man's face was etched with quiet sympathy. He set the lantern down gently. "My lord," he said, voice hushed, "the men are asking for you. King Stannis is settling the final arrangements. I thought you might need some time." Jon swallowed the lump in his throat. "Thank you, Ser Davos." Slowly, he rose, turning to look one last time at Robb's body. "We'll bury him beside our father," Jon said. He should be with him." Davos nodded. "I'll see to it. If you wish, we can arrange a small ceremony. Let the men of the North pay respects to their king." Jon gave a half nod, uncertain. "Yes, that might be best. He deserves that much." They left the crypt in somber silence, the torch's glow receding behind them until Robb was alone with the sleeping kings of winter, who had never awakened to see their bloodline torn apart. Jon's steps were slow, as if each foot weighed a stone. When they emerged into the corridor, a chill draft struck them. The war in the courtyard had ended, but echoes of it lingered, the smell of smoke, the shouts of men clearing rubble, the quiet sobs of women who found their loved ones dead. Word had spread, Robb Stark was fallen. Some of Robb's captured men were disconsolate, weeping or silent with shock. A handful hurled insults at Jon when he passed, calling him kinslayer and bastard traitor. Jon let the words wash over him without reaction. How could he refute them? In their eyes, he was everything vile. Perhaps in his own eyes, too. If he had chosen differently, Robb might still live. As he crossed the yard, he met Stannis near the battered gate. The king surveyed the damage with a stony gaze. He turned to Jon. "We have secured the castle fully," Stannis said. "Your brother's men are either slain, captive, or scattered. They pose no immediate threat. The north is ours." Jon stared at the ruined gate, the churned snow soaked in blood, the bodies still being carried out. "Then what?" he asked, voice hollow. "The realm is at war still, the Lannisters in King's Landing, the Tyrells at their side. And we have the Greyjoys on the coasts." Stannis gave a curt nod. "Aye, and the snows deepen each day. We'll hold the north through this winter, gather more houses to our cause. In spring we march south to claim the Iron Throne. That was always the plan. Now the north is pacified." The word grated on Jon. Pacified at the cost of his brother's life. Ghost brushed against his leg as though sensing Jon's despair. Stannis' expression flickered with something like empathy. "I know this day has been a bitter one for you," the king said, "but your sacrifice was necessary." The boys' rebellion could have torn the realm further apart. Jon's voice sounded distant to his own ears. It was not sacrifice. It was betrayal. Stannis said nothing to dispute that. He simply placed a hand on Jon's shoulder, though it felt as heavy as a gauntlet. "You are Lord of Winterfell now, Warden of the North. Own that title. Earn it. If you still feel guilt, use it to rule wisely." With that, he turned away, directing men to replace the gate with timbers from the winter stores. Jon watched him go, a hollowness in his chest. Earn it. How could he ever earn what he had gained through blood? Night fell late in these winter days. Jon oversaw the final disposal of the bodies, ensuring that high-born men from northern houses were set aside for respectful interment. The small folks dead were prepared for mass burial in the crypt yard. Men from Robb's host who had surrendered were offered the chance to swear fealty to Stannis or else remain in cells until further notice. Some complied, others refused. The refusal meant they would be locked in the dungeons. Few illusions remained about the generosity of Stannis Baratheon. Exhausted, Jon found no rest that night. He walked the corridors of Winterfell like a ghost. At times, he could almost see Robb's silhouette rounding a corner or climbing a stair. But it was only his imagination taunting him. Finally, he found himself in the Godwood, the heart tree looming in stillness. The snow had nearly stopped. Moonlight glimmered on the water of the small pool, partially frozen at the edges. The red leaves of the weirwood were dusted with white, a quiet statement of the old god's watch. Jon sank to his knees in the snow, looking up at the carved face in the bark. It seemed to weep red sap tears, as if lamenting the day's carnage. "I am lost," Jon whispered to the silent tree. "If you are there, if you can hear me. I've done a terrible thing. I wanted to save the North, to keep the war from devouring us all, but I've only destroyed my own blood." The old gods gave no answer. The night air was quiet, the pool still. But Jon felt the weight of the place pressing in, as if the spirits of his ancestors bore witness. "I never wanted to be a Stark this way," he said, voice breaking. "Robb was the rightful heir. My father, he'd be ashamed. I know it." He closed his eyes, letting sorrow consume him. How long he knelt there, he did not know. At some point, Ghost pressed against his side, offering warmth. Eventually, when the chill became unbearable, Jon rose. The wind sighed through the leaves, providing neither comfort nor condemnation. He left the Godswoe, returning to the castle that was now his, though it felt more like a crypt than a home. In the weeks that followed, winter tightened its grip on the north. Stannis declared Winterfell secure. He named men to high positions, awarding some measure of authority to those houses that had bent the knee. The Manderleys at White Harbor, upon hearing of Robb's death, sent cautious feelers about forging an alliance with the new regime. Some of Robb's former allies drifted away, refusing to submit. They vanished into the winter wilds or holed up in distant keeps. But with the death of the king in the north, the heart of the rebellion had been cut out. Stannis's hold on Winterfell solidified, at least until the spring melt might allow for further conflict. Jon performed his duties with mechanical efficiency. He surveyed repairs, oversaw the distribution of rationed food, gave quiet orders to ensure that the small folk sheltering in Winterfell's Wintertown had enough fuel for their fires. Men addressed him as Lord Stark, or My Lord, some with respect, others with averted eyes. He responded politely but distantly. Inside, he was numb, going through the motions of a life he had chosen at too high a price. He found no solace in Melisandre's talk of prophecy, nor in the martial pride of Stannis's knights. Each night, the memory of Robb's final moments haunted him. Each day, the tasks of holding the North demanded his attention, forcing him to present a stoic front. Sometimes, in the hush before dawn, he would wander to the crypts to sit with Robb's tomb, speaking words he could never say while Robb lived. Other times, he climbed to the highest tower and stared northward, remembering the wall and the oath he had forsaken. The war was not over. More battles would come once the snows thawed. The Lannisters still held the Iron Throne, and new rumors sprang up like weeds. Whispers that the Freys had done something monstrous at the Twins, that the Riverlands were up in arms, that Balon Greyjoy had died, and a succession crisis raged in the Iron Islands. But for now, in the deep winter, the realm paused in a hush of blood-stained frost. Winterfell's halls echoed with the footsteps of men who knew they might soon march south in a new campaign. The North's future lay in the hands of a king from the south and a lord who had killed his own brother's cause. One morning, as Jon paced the battlements in a bitter wind, Davos Seaworth joined him. The old smuggler had become something of a quiet confidant to Jon in recent weeks, offering pragmatic advice or a sympathetic ear. He leaned against a Merlin, breath steaming in the cold. "The days grow darker, my lord," Davos said gently. "Soon it will be the longest night of the year." Jon stared out over the white-draped fields, the broken gate repaired with thick timbers. "Winterfell has known many nights," he said. "But this one feels endless." Davos nodded. "The men speak of you with respect, you know. You've handled the holding well, better than many expected. Even those who cursed you for Robb Stark's death can't deny you keep the peace." Jon's mouth twisted in a bitter smile. "The peace we bought with my brother's blood." "Aye." Davos was never one to shy away from the truth. "That can't be changed now. You can only move forward, protect the North as you intended." Jon let out a shuddering breath. Protect the North from itself, or from what lies beyond the wall? "I sometimes wonder if I should have stayed in the Night's Watch, ignoring the wars of kings and princes. But it's too late for that, isn't it?" Davos's eyes were kind. "We all do what we think is best at the time, my lord. In war, no choice is clean. No choice is clean." Jon gazed over Winterfell's courtyard, the place where he had knelt by Robb's side as life slipped away. Could it truly have gone any other way? Even if he had joined Robb, the war might have brought them all to ruin. Or perhaps they could have stood strong together, staving off the Lannisters, forging alliances. Jon would never know. He had made his choice, and so had Robb, and the final cost was written in blood. A gust of wind whipped across the battlements, stirring flakes of fresh snow. Jon turned away from the parapet, expression set. "I'll do what I must," he said quietly, "even if it means carrying this guilt for the rest of my life." Davos put a hand on his shoulder. "Then at least that guilt may guide you to justice. That, I think, would honor your father." Jon closed his eyes, thinking of Ned Stark's quiet, resolute face. He felt tears threatening again, but he forced them away. "Perhaps," he said, voice steady. "I'll try." He descended the steps with Davos, ghost padding beside them. Men saluted as Jon passed, each act a reminder that he now stood as the Warden of the North, that Stannis had elevated him for his own purposes. The snows drifted on, blanketing the footprints of the living and the dead alike. Winter had come indeed, and with it a hush that seemed to cradle the sorrow of the North. Only the gods could say what spring would bring. In the days that followed, the news of Robb Stark's death spread throughout the region. Ravens carried tidings to White Harbor, to the Dreadfort, to Bear Island. Some houses acknowledged Stannis' claim, albeit reluctantly, or with the kind of neutrality that signaled their desire merely to survive the winter. Others seated in silence, cursing Jon Stark's name behind closed doors. The Umber clan, once fiercely loyal to the Starks, split. Part of them had lost men in Robb's host and now nursed a quiet vendetta, while others turned pragmatic and bent the knee to keep their lands safe. And so the North settled into a fragile stasis, a lull in the storm of war. Inside Winterfell, repairs continued by torchlight as well as daylight. The library was cleared of debris, the walls patched where the Ironborn had wreaked havoc. Stannis insisted on strengthening the castle's defenses, mindful of the possibility that come spring, the Lannisters or Greyjoys might try their luck. Jon carried out the orders quietly, feeling each hammered nail and laid stone as another weight on his conscience. He took no pleasure in his title nor in the knowledge that he was, by law, Eddard Stark's heir. At times, he dreamed of that moment when Stannis' hand touched his head, naming him Jon Stark. He awoke each time with a hollow ache, recalling how that title had set him on a collision course with Robb. In the gloom of his chambers, he would watch the embers in the hearth, wondering if some alternate fate might have spared them both. But regrets were wind over a frozen lake, offering no path forward. Winter's nights lengthened. The solstice approached, the darkest stretch of the year. On one such night, Jon found himself again in the Godwood, kneeling at the edge of the frozen pool, the reflection of moonlight in the ice a dim shimmer. He had come here often, searching for some sense of absolution. The old gods offered only silence, as they always had. But silence, perhaps, was better than the accusations that haunted him in every corridor. A soft crunch of snow alerted him to another presence. He turned to see Davos once more, carrying a single candle lantern to ward off the darkness. The older man paused, as though uncertain if he should intrude. "My lord," Davos said quietly, "forgive me, but the king is asking for you. He has matters to discuss, supplies for a possible foray to the Dreadfort in spring. He wants your insight on the Boltons." Jon inhaled, staring at the weirwood's carved face. "Very well," he murmured. "Tell him I'll come presently." Davos nodded, then approached a step, sympathy plain in his eyes. You've carried a heavy burden these past weeks. It's not my place to advise you on your faith or your family, but if you ever need an ear, I'm here. Jon offered the ghost of a grateful nod. Thank you. You've been kinder than I deserve. Davos shook his head. I know something of living with guilt, my lord. Let us hope we can shape a better future for these people. A faint stirring in Jon's chest. Yes, he said softly. Let's hope. He rose, brushing snow from his knees, and followed Davos out of the godwood. The old gate leading to the courtyard stood reinforced, a posted guard saluting as they passed. The night sky above was a tapestry of stars, cold and distant. In that moment, Jon felt every choice that had led him here like an iron chain. Yet he also felt a grim determination bud within him. Robb was gone, taken by the war neither of them had asked for but both had stepped into. If any good was to come of Jon's betrayal, he would make sure it served the people who still lived. He climbed the steps to the great keep, Ghost patting at his side. The dogged loyalty of the dire wolf was a faint consolation. The corridors were dimly lit, servants hurrying to stoke hearths against the bitter cold. Passing a window, Jon saw the courtyard dusted with fresh snow, the moon's glow revealing the faint outlines of the repairs. Men who had died on that ground only weeks ago were now buried or burned, ghosts in the memory of Winterfell's ancient stones. In the great hall, Stannis stood near the dais, conferring with a small circle of knights. Maps lay scattered across a table. Melisandre was present, her red robes bright in the gloom, eyes scanning the group as if reading hidden truths. Jon approached, shoulders squared, bracing himself for another conversation about the war that had cost him so dearly. Stannis gave Jon a curt nod. I was beginning to think you meant to hide among the trees again. No matter. We've word that the Boltons have locked their gates, refusing to acknowledge me. When the snows thaw, I mean to march on the Dreadfort and bring them to heel. I expect your counsel, as you know the Boltons' tactics. Jon stepped to the table, ignoring the ache in his chest. The Boltons had fought under Robb's banner once, but that ended in betrayal. Now they claimed loyalty to neither side, or so it seemed. They're cunning, Jon said, his voice steadier than he felt. They rely on fear and they know the land. But in a direct siege you may succeed. The Dreadfort is formidable, yet not as large as Winterfell. Stannis nodded, gazing at the map. We'll plan thoroughly. This time I'll not be taken unawares. The North is mine to rule, and no upstart flayer will disrupt that. Do you concur? Jon forced himself to speak the words of duty. Yes, your grace. The Boltons must be subdued. They bring only terror to the North. Stannis studied him, as if noticing Jon's hollow tone. He offered no comfort, only turned back to the map and continued conferring with his knights. Jon answered questions mechanically, describing the approach to the Dreadfort, the terrain along the route, the best time of year for such a march. Davos listened, occasionally adding an observation about supplies. Melisandre watched Jon with her usual mysterious intensity, but said little. At last, the plan was roughed out. Come spring, or as soon as the snows weakened, Stannis would lead a concentrated force eastward to the Dreadfort. He expected Jon to join him to unify the North and enforce Baratheon rule. The moment the meeting ended, Jon excused himself and returned to the courtyard. The cold night air stung his lungs, but it was better than the suffocating tension inside. He stood near the battered gate, gazing out at the moonlit expanse where Robb's forces had once approached. The memory of that day was etched in every shadow. Beyond, somewhere in the darkness, Grey Wind prowled alone, if he yet lived. Jon's imagination conjured the image of the wounded direwolf howling at the moon, searching for the master who would never return. Jon closed his eyes, letting the anguish wash over him. He was Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, and utterly alone. All that remained now was to do his duty, to try and honor the land he had cost so much blood to protect. If the others truly stirred beyond the wall, if the realm was in peril from undead horrors, he would need every ounce of strength, every alliance, to stand against them. That was the reason he had chosen this path, had it not been? To guard the living from a threat that dwarfed mortal wars. Perhaps in that final cause, he might find some measure of redemption. In the hush of the winter night, Jon knelt once more, pressing a hand to the snow. I will protect them, he murmured, as if vowing to his lost brother, to his father, to all who had died. I swear it. Ghost nuzzled him in quiet solidarity. The night sky offered no reply, save for the icy wind that sighed over the battlements. Jon rose, shoulders squared, and walked back into the castle. Duty remained, even if hope seemed scarce. He was a Stark now, for better or worse, and he would face whatever came, White Walkers, Lannisters, or the ghosts of regret, with whatever resolve he could muster. The haunting echoes of betrayal might never leave him, but he would wield that pain like a blade, cutting a path toward whatever fragile peace might remain for the North. So began Jon Stark's new rule over Winterfell, built on the broken foundation of war and sealed by a brother's blood. The darkest nights were yet ahead, and dawn seemed a distant dream. But in those silent corridors and snow-blanketed courtyards, he carried forward, step by step, with only Ghost's steady presence to remind him that, once, he had been a boy who laughed and sparred with Robb in these very halls. And that, though the scars might never fade, some part of him would keep fighting to save what was left of his father's homeland.